In our world, the Mongol invasion of Europe was devastating, but relatively short, for a variety of reasons we have covered and will cover on our Kings and Generals channel. But what if the initial Mongol invasion of Poland and Hungary was followed up by a much more massive one due to a small change in events? What if the Mongols found allies in Europe, leading to an invasion, putting the one by Attila the Hun to shame? What if that led to a massive change in the political, religious and economic life of Europe in the 13th century? In this alternative history video, we will talk about the Mongol invasion of Europe. Needless to say, the Mongol invasion struck terror into the hearts of Europeans. While most people fortunately don't have to experience this, the same brain chemistry can be kicked into action even in peace and quiet, and mental health isn't easily defended alone. That's why we bring you a special offer with our sponsor BetterHelp at betterhelp.com/wizardsandwarriors. If there's something you need to talk about and the thought of going to or even needing therapy is too difficult to face, try a new approach. Different to classic in-person sessions, BetterHelp can set you up with professional help provided over the phone, video, or even messaging. They have over 30,000 therapists waiting to give you the help you need, as and when you ask for it, with full control and discretion in your hands. You can fill out a questionnaire online to get you matched with suitable professionals, which in most cases is done within 48 hours. After that, there are no hard commitments. Pick the times and methods that fit your needs, and change things up if it's not working whenever you wish. It doesn't have to be horse archers at the gates. BetterHelp will aid with whatever's impacting you, big or small. Check out BetterHelp via our link, betterhelp.com/wizardsandwarriors. This link gives you a 10% discount on your first month to help you give BetterHelp a go. In 1242, the Mongols defeated and plundered Poland and Hungary, raided parts of the Holy Roman Empire, and began an organized withdrawal, which resulted in a catastrophe for the entire Balkan region. Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and even the Latin Empire of Constantinople were subjected to the horrors of the Horde prior to becoming tributaries, before the Mongols regrouped and went home. But contrary to popular belief, the Mongols did not withdraw due to the death of their Khan. Instead, this was a planned maneuver aimed at resting their warriors who had been campaigning for many years and replenishing the losses from attrition. Dozens of prolonged sieges, smaller raids being repulsed in Austria and Bohemia, as well as mountain ambushes in Croatia and Bulgaria took a toll on the Mongolians, but they had every intention to return. The plan for the second invasion was delayed due to the internal rivalries that arose as a consequence of the Great Khan's behavior. After his favorite son Chochu died in 1237, Ogedei drowned his sorrow in alcohol and withdrew from governing, allowing his court and wife Turgeni to create plots that eroded the unity of the Mongols. But what if Chochu didn't die, and Ogedei remained politically active and healthy for the remainder of his now extended life? The year is 1245, and after a summer of grazing their mounts, the Mongols set their sights on Europe once more, ready to finish what they started. Among the veterans of the previous campaigns under the overall command of Batu, the army is joined by the successful contingent under Baiju Noyan, who defeated the Seljuk Turks and their allies at the Battle of Consolidating in 1243, and secured the tributary status of all of Anatolia except Nicaea. Many Chinese engineers and healers were also brought in, while tributaries like Bulgaria, Serbia and the Kievan Rus were forced to supply infantry soldiers for the army, as well as tactical information. Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod and Daniel of Galicia personally joined the campaign with 5,000 soldiers each, hoping to appease their overlords and expand their holdings. Overall, the army consisted of 120,000 mixed troops from across the empire, which would be separated into 4 armies, each with a specific goal. The first army, led by Subotai and Alexander Nevsky, was ordered to ride out from Novgorod and attack the states along the Baltic coast, while the second army, commanded by Kadan, Orda and Daniel of Galicia, would repeat the route of the previous invasion of Poland, with the third main army, commanded by Batu, Burka and Shiban, penetrating the Carpathian Mountains from multiple entry points to overwhelm Hungary. Finally, the last army under Baiju Noyan planned to make its way across the Balkans, solidifying Mongol control and gathering troops from the newly acquired tributary states. Dozens of messengers were prepared to coordinate the four groups, allowing them to converge on the Holy Roman Empire as one. The countless captives and spies the Mongols had gathered from across Europe informed them that while the West had formidable fortifications and warriors, they were divided. England under Henry III had just invaded France and was defeated at the Battle of Taibor in 1242, but the French king Louis IX gave them lenient terms as he was more focused on the upcoming Crusade to retake Jerusalem, which fell in 1244 to a Khwarezmian army which the Mongols displaced. The kingdoms of Portugal, Castile and Aragon had just expanded their power to Lisbon, Seville and Valencia after the most successful phase of the Reconquista, but most importantly, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II waged war against Pope Innocent IV, who had just excommunicated him for the fourth time, and the empire was split in two. And so on September 5, 1245, a divided Europe was flooded with reports of the returning invaders. Alexander Nevsky, who had guarded Novgorod from their attacks as well as against Sweden, now pressed his advantage, easily annexing Estonia, whose Danish overlord was in the middle of a war with Holstein. The first Grand Duke of Lithuania, Mindaugas, knew he didn't stand a chance and instantly submitted to the Mongols, even joining their ranks to fight the Holy Order. The Teutonic Knights were sent by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II to Prussia in 1230 in order to convert the local pagans, who were divided in many tribes and protected their culture. While they lacked unity, they were ferocious in battle and managed to capture and kill many knights, so when the Mongols arrived in the midst of their uprising, many turned to the religiously tolerant invaders. The fortresses in the region were strong, and Subotai preferred to enlist the help of the Prussians, who assisted Chinese engineers in exploiting the weaknesses of the fortifications. By now, the Mongols were adept in siege warfare, but the smaller, well-defended castles and citadels were capable of slowing down the campaign. Meanwhile, the more familiar Poland fell even quicker than last time. After the Mongols killed Henry II in Legnica in 1241, the remaining dukes waged war on each other as they scrambled for the throne. Using the same strategy of divide and conquer, the Mongols quickly took over the lands, crushing the half-rebuilt castles in their wake, and prevented any sizable force being assembled against them. Lublin, Poznan, Gniezno and Krakow were razed to the ground in quick succession, and in May 1246, Duke Bolesław II the Horned, who ruled the western part of Poland, decided to join the Mongols in an attempt to avoid the devastation they brought and gain power over the other fallen duchies. Kadan was well aware that he needed allies to maintain control over the newly conquered lands and accepted this submission. Bela IV of Hungary was the only man in Europe anticipating these events and did everything in his power to prepare for them. He settled Cumans and Germans in the devastated regions, started the construction of dozens of stone castles, and began training elite heavy cavalry. However, the Mongol attack came earlier than he expected, and their multi-prong attack through the Carpathian Mountains surprised him. The massive infrastructural projects were mostly half done, as the reeling nation, still suffering from the famine caused by the previous invasion, was overwhelmed by Batu. Smaller skirmishes occurred across the Great Hungarian Plain, especially between the Mongols and their Cuman cousins, but none of these engagements were able to make a dent in the Mongol war machine. In March 1246, the Hungarian king fled to the Dalmatian Islands as he did before, while both his old capital of Esztergom and the new one Buda were destroyed. Batu already knew that the islands were the refuge Bela would seek, and was prepared for it better than last time. The Fourth Army under Baiju, coming in through the Balkans, chased Bela after solidifying the allegiance of Bulgaria, Serbia and Bosnia. The fleeing king was intercepted near Zagreb, and despite the desperate last stand of his royal guard, was captured, allowing the Mongols to use him. While the King of Hungary was in captivity, they began spreading letters with his royal seal, urging the people of Hungary and beyond to surrender to the Great Khan, I urge you now to end your resistance against the Tatar hosts and do not impede their progress. Do not deny their demands or requests for food and supply. When they command the destruction of our walls, we must do so, for now their horsemen are our wall, stronger than any stone and mortar. Accept their rule without struggle, and fighting in the Hungarian Kingdom will quickly end. This is my command as King of Hungary and Croatia, Bela, sent on the 7th of April, 1246. By the summer, the entirety of Eastern Europe was under the hooves of Mongol horses, with only a few stone fortresses in Prussia still resisting the constant barrage of the Chinese torsion mangonels. The forces of Batu and Baiju merged and marched for Vienna on August 9th, not just for conquest, but vengeance. The Duke of Austria, Frederick the Quarrelsome, was one of the few who managed to defy the Mongols at both Mohi and his homeland. But that was against small raiding parties. As he now faced the full might of the Mongol army, he was forced to make a choice: withdraw towards the Loibel Pass, alongside the Dukes of Carinthia and Carniola as his emperor requested, or merge his force with the only ruler capable of meeting the Mongols in open combat, King of Bohemia Wenceslaus I, who commanded 2,000 knights, 4,000 crossbowmen and 15,000 infantry. Frederick was never one to back out of a fight, so he evacuated his citizens and marched towards Prague with a 5,000-strong army on the 16th of August, while a token garrison was left to guard Vienna and other notable strongholds. The Mongols employed their usual tactic of overwhelming their foes by attacking Bohemia from multiple sides on September 14th, with Kadan and his Polish contingent attacking from the north, while Orda and Daniel's Ruthenian army attacked from the east. The latter was delayed for over a month, as constant harassment from the Bohemian raiders slowed their movement in the densely forested passage. Palisades were built with large ditches dug behind them, and night raids were frequent. The Ruthenians were ahead of the main line, as they were seen as far less valuable than the Mongol elite soldiers, which made them disgruntled and slowed the progress even further. One night, while they made camp, Daniel confronted Orda. "When you changed my wine for fermented milk, you said I was one of you now, yet why are my men the ones getting killed?" The King of Ruthenia was slapped across the face for even raising his voice to Orda. In September, Orda and his army were in a desperate need of supplies, so when they made the crossing, they ravaged the countryside. However, after several raiding parties went missing, he was forced to pick some of his best men to scout the region and locate the enemy host. It didn't take long before the riders caught a lesser noble, who informed the Mongols that the Bohemian king was preparing his forces to attack Kadan in the north. Orda immediately began constructing pontoon bridges over the Morava River, leaving Daniel of Ruthenia to guard them, while the more mobile Mongols united with the second force. Word was sent to Batu of their movements, but it was too late, as Orda walked right into the Bohemian trap. On the 21st of September, Wenceslaus had actually camped near Brno with his 21,000 men. Once the Mongols encountered the army, they began harassing it before feigning a retreat. The Bohemian heavy-mounted knights took the bait and charged against the faster light cavalry, which occasionally stopped to take a shot at the pursuers. Some knights turned back, but others charged in before the Mongols surrounded them. The exhausted and wounded horses could not keep up, and one by one they fell to the ground or began to flee, only to be picked off by heavy lancers. By the time the bodies were ransacked, the main Bohemian force arrived, and the Mongols realized that the battle was far from over. A smaller 5,000-strong force, led by Frederick the Quarrelsome, had crossed over through Olomouc and was reported moving against the Mongols from the north, and this time Orda called for an immediate withdrawal through the pontoon bridges on the Morava River. However, this was when the Ruthenians, who were tired of being mistreated by the Mongols and knew this was their only hope of being free again, betrayed Orda. When a small portion of his army made it across, the Ruthenians slaughtered them and set fire to the bridges. The Mongols were stuck, surrounded, with nowhere to retreat to. Orda knew his only chance was to fight his way out, so he ordered his heavy lancers to charge at the Austrian Duke, while the horse archers performed the caracole maneuver, sending whistling arrows flying at the crossbowmen to cover the main charge. The shrieking sounds terrified the Bohemian horses, who froze up while the crossbowmen returned fire. Frederick rode ahead, personally leading the vanguard, inspiring his men who met the Mongols in the open plains. Meanwhile, the Ruthenians, situated at the other side of the river, sent arrows at the Mongols. Despite their best attempts, the charge could not break through the enemy ranks, and they were pushed back by the Austrian knights. However, that victory came at a heavy price, as the last member of the Babenberg dynasty, Duke Frederick, suffered a mortal injury. His men dragged him back while continuing the fight, allowing the Bohemian infantry to close in and engage thousands of dismounted warriors. The Mongol horse archers were ordered to circle around the main force, which proved incredibly effective, as they were able to fire at the side and back of the advancing Bohemians. But then the heavy mounted knights joined the fray, smashing into the Mongol flank. The nomads managed to keep their formation despite being surrounded, thus prolonging the battle that lasted well into the evening. At this point, a group of knights located Order and engaged his bodyguards. Many of them perished, but by the end of the fight, one of them managed to land a killing blow to Jochi's firstborn and Chinggis Khan's first grandchild. Most of the Mongol army perished, with only a few dozen exhausted, betrayed and wounded riders managing to scatter across the countryside. Bohemia managed to inflict the greatest defeat on a Mongol army yet. Few Mongols survived, but those who did told the story of the Ruthenian betrayal and Order's defeat, which infuriated the Mongol leaders. While the defeat at Olomouc was a crushing blow to the Mongols, they still had tens of thousands of men on the field, who now had even more cause to conquer the rest of the continent. Kadan wasted no time mourning the death of his cousin and unleashed his fury on Bohemia. In October 1246, after devastating the countryside, the citadel of Kaslor was assaulted with human projectiles until the defenders surrendered. But before he could attack an army or Prague itself, he received a letter from Subotai, who ordered him to pull back and regroup. As for Batu, after he learned that his older brother died at the hands of the Duke of Austria, he subjected Vienna to unspeakable horrors, and the city fell to a combination of psychological warfare, mangonels and sappers on October 1st, 1246. As Vienna fell, another letter was circulating the royal courts of Western Europe. Innocent, bishop, servant of the servants of God, though we are engaged in difficult matters and distracted by manifold anxieties, yet among those things which demand our constant attention is the Tatar advance. Indeed, the wicked race of the Tatars, seeking to subdue or rather utterly destroy the Christian people, having gathered for a long time past the strength of all their tribes, have entered Christendom. So savage has been their devastation that their sword spared neither sex nor age, but raged with fearful brutality upon all alike. It caused unparalleled havoc and destruction in these countries in its unbroken advance. I am pierced with the deepest sorrow for our brothers and sisters, but there is still hope. By the grace of our Lord, one of the infidel armies was vanquished by the joint forces of King Wenceslaus and Duke Frederick of Austria, who gave his life to protect our realm. Therefore, the Church beg, urge, and earnestly command all of you, as far as you can, to take up the cross and arms, follow their example, and defend the Christian faith and lands. We lay it down that at an opportune time, to be made known to all the faithful by preachers and our special envoys, all who are ready to take the cross should gather at suitable places for this purpose, so that they may proceed from there with the blessing of God and the Apostolic See to the assistance of our brethren in the East.
King Wenceslaus of Bohemia managed to achieve the impossible. But as his domain became flooded with Polish, Hungarian and Austrian refugees, he knew that the war against the Mongols was just beginning. The Ruthenians had managed to secure not only numerous pieces of Mongol equipment, but also valuable information, detailing the extent of the nomadic threat. Cups were raised, bodies were buried, wounds were bandaged, and the once rival Frederick the Quarrelsome was now given a special funeral in Prague as a martyr. But Wenceslaus knew that there was little time for celebration or mourning, as he read the papal call to crusade. As Louis IX read a copy of that same parchment, he knew that this called for unprecedented action, even if that meant a radical change in his policies. The Capetian king was known to be generous, patient, just, compromising, courageous, and a patron of the arts, but above all, he was the most devout Christian king who ever lived. After defeating a coalition of rebellious vassals supported by Henry III, Louis fell seriously ill with a form of malaria at the end of 1244. Upon his recovery, which he saw as a sign, he pledged to take the cross and lead the Seventh Crusade into the Holy Land. But now he knew that his army would have to face a different enemy, one that threatened the very heart of Christendom itself. Edicts were issued to every corner of France, which was now the strongest state in Europe, arriving at the castles of noble families who had by this point made crusading a favourite hobby, each house boasting the number of its ancestors who took the cross. Additionally, the wide spy network was directed outwards to the neighbouring empire in order to entangle its web of alliances and dynastic ties. Indeed, the Holy Roman Empire was far more fractured than ever, with hundreds of factions, loosely held by claims, marriages, and shared hatred for either the papacy or emperor. Louis quickly discovered that not only was Frederick's empire divided in two, but between the hundreds of princes, only a few were prosperous or had any form of stability. Among them were Holland, Thuringia, Brunswick, Jülich, Nassau, Savoy, Bavaria, Meissen, and above all Brandenburg, which rose from a backwater county to a dominant regional power under the leadership of John and Otto, two brothers who ruled jointly. Between them was the rising Rhenish League, featuring over 50 prosperous towns, under the joint leadership of their clergies and merchants. Finally, there were unstable regions, such as all of Italy, the battlefield on which the imperial loyalists faced the papal supporters. Additionally, the war had depleted the areas of Lorraine, Holstein, and Mecklenburg, as well as numerous small-scale skirmishes. In Friesland, a small sect of Cathars was crushed by the Ständiger Crusade in 1234, and the region was still devastated. On paper, the empire was strong, but even in its darkest hours, it was never more divided. Louis wanted to enact the order of the Pope and beat back the Mongols, but even if he managed to gain the support of most of the princes, looking at the map, he understood that the logistics of this campaign would be untenable. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick's supporters surrounded Bohemia, controlled the Alpine passes, and thanks to the recent victory at the Battle of Giglio, the Imperial Navy of Pisa crushed Genoa, thus assuring naval dominance in the region. Frederick II's refusal to join the crusade and command to every lord not to engage the Mongol host but hold up in their castles meant that no army could reach Bohemia without risking their supply lines. The solution was extreme but necessary. During the winter of 1246, Pope Innocent IV toured the cities of France preaching the Seventh Crusade, with the kings of France, Aragon and Navarre riding behind him. This procession culminated on Christmas Eve at the unfinished Cathedral of Notre Dame, where Louis IX was appointed as the leader of the Seventh Crusade, aimed against the Mongols. Additionally, the one-year-old marriage between his brother Charles and Beatrice of Provence was annulled, so that King James of Aragon would take her hand. In return, Charles was promised the crown of the Kingdom of Sicily, once the now 5 times excommunicated Frederick II was vanquished. Finally, in the place of the pretender, the savior Wenceslaus was selected to be the next emperor. The majority of the French nobility swore upon holy relics, including the crown of thorns, and prepared to head east, while Louis shook the hand of his old rival James, who was the only one who could crush Pisa's fleet. Back in the east, an emergency Kurultai was assembled by the leader of the campaign, Batu, where all major leaders were called to discuss their response. The size of the host and years of careful planning that went into assembling it matched their resolve, but their failure to predict the Ruthenian betrayal raised many questions. How should they punish the traitors? Should their policy towards the tributaries change? Who would get the task of avenging Batu's brother? And lastly, how would they regain access to the steppe? Each leader put their proposal forward. with many urging Batu to trust no one but his own people. Subotai came up with a plan that not only punished the disobedient Ruthenians, but tested Nevsky and Mindaugas, whose cavalry, and especially infantry, were crucial for the success of the campaign. The tributaries would be turned against the Mongolians' enemies, with the promise to keep what they conquered, as long as the land itself was left barren. In the meantime, the main host trampled its way towards Prague. The Mongols took King Bela's son, Stefan, and started indoctrinating him. The 7-year-old boy was a royal hostage in Batu's court, accompanying him wherever he went. A move meant to keep the captured Hungarian king in check, who knew that if his son was lost, his line might die out. As for the King of Poland, Boleslav, his brother was forced into the Keshik, the royal guard, who made sure he was safe and knew the Mongols' ways. Subotai ensured that his tributaries understood the price of betrayal by sending them on a brutal campaign, where they had to personally collect the ears of the fallen Poles and Ruthenians. The northern front covered a large area, which was quickly assaulted by Boleslav, Alexander, and Mindaugas. Subotai merely acted as an overseer, forcing the vassals to inflict unspeakable horrors on the rebellious towns and villages. Another Tumen, led by Berka, crossed the Carpathian Mountains once more, using its superior mobility to shock the defenders of Halich in the winter cold. When the dust settled, there was no trace of either Leo or the capital of the region. The destruction was so systematic that the site remained uninhabited for the next few hundred years. Daniel, the Ruthenian king without a kingdom, and his remaining 4,000 were cut off from their homes and could do nothing to prevent their destruction. Back in Bohemia, Wenceslaus was facing a difficult dilemma. The majority of the electors had chosen him as emperor, a countermeasure against both Frederick II and the Mongols, but the only way that could be achieved was if he was crowned in Mainz by the Archbishop of Cologne. There was no telling when the Mongols would strike, and even a short absence could mean the fall of the kingdom. But the grim reality was nearly half of his army was lost at the Battle of Olomouc. Moravia was devastated by not one but 2 invasions in the span of 5 years, and the only way he could save his country was if he returned at the head of a massive host. In order to prevent a mass panic, Wenceslaus left both of his sons at the capital as a sign that he would return, leaving Bohemia in the hands of his heir Vladislaus. The weapons ransacked from the Mongol corpses were distributed between the refugees, and the majority of the Ruthenians under Daniel garrisoned the formidable Prague castle, bringing the number of defenders to 10,000. In March 1247, Wenceslaus headed west with a few hundred knights and refugees from Ruthenia, Poland, Austria, and Hungary. He also brought Mongol bows, lances, armor, some captives, and even the corpses of a few fallen soldiers and their mounts, in order to show the people of the empire that the enemy was real, but not invincible. Upon entering the lands ruled by Frederick's supporters, he was stopped, leading to a tense confrontation. However, the king was also escorted by his wife Kunigunda, who was the cousin of the emperor, and managed to fool the guards, who were told that she was being escorted to her ancestral home in Swabia. Once he crossed into Thuringia, Wenceslaus was met by Margrave Henry Raspe, who congratulated him on his victory and joined his host. With each day, more and more crusaders arrived, begging to get a glimpse of the Mongol bodies and study their weaponry. Even with orders to defeat and losses to attrition, Batu's force numbered 100,000. However, at this stage, he knew he had to pick his battles, at least until Ruthenia was leveled. A third of that number was designated to carry out the task, while another 50,000 were reserved for the Bohemian campaign, giving the rest time to consolidate Poland and Hungary. The goal was to conquer the powerful and well-defended Kingdom of Bohemia before the winter, as the Mongols preferred to fight the large-scale campaigns between spring and winter, giving enough time to overcome its defenses and rendezvous with the forces of Subotai and Berka. The Bohemian Massif was a well-defined border, with multiple choke points which were easy to defend. However, Batu devised a plan meant to overwhelm his opponent by sending smaller parties through every possible entry point in order to check the readiness of the Bohemian army. These raids began in April 1247. They gathered information and secured several passes into the countryside. The four leaders then poured in, wreaking havoc as they went. The nomads avoided any stone fortifications, instead focusing on small towns and villages, from which they gathered thousands of slaves. Whenever groups of refugees were spotted, they were driven towards Prague, which now swelled from 22,000 inhabitants to over 60,000. Ostrava, Brno, Hradec and many others were wiped off the map as the Christians prayed for the return of the king. According to the unknown chronicler, indiscriminate slaughter marked their track, and fiendish tortures of their prisoners gratified their revenge until no eye remained open to weep for the dead. Prague was separated by the massive Vltava River in two parts, with the urban centre sitting on the right, while the castle was located on the left. The only link between them was the Judith Bridge, since Vladislaus ordered all other wooden footpaths across the river to be destroyed. Additionally, scouts patrolled the left bank daily, so that no pontoon bridges could be built by the Mongols. Batu quickly learned that the king had left the country, and that there was no way he could bypass the river without risking his return or delaying the campaign further. The Bohemians dug a large moat in front of their stone wall, prepared provisions, hired mercenaries, and stocked their towers with arrows and projectiles. The Mongols dug their own ditches and built a palisade surrounding the city as they assembled their siege weapons. On the 12th of May, the Mongols sent an envoy urging the citizens to surrender the city and their Ruthenian guests if they wanted to keep their heads. The messenger was strangled and put on top of one of the captured Mongol horses, a letter pinned to his chest. "You heathens may be proficient in the slaughter of women, children and cowards, but here you will find no absolution, only the Lord's wrath." The reaction was immediate. Protective wooden screens were pushed ahead of rams and teams of sappers, each strapped with dozens of captives who were tied to their beams. Traction catapults pulled by more captives, and finally oxbows, sending massive javelins with explosive grenades tied at the end. The crossbowmen had no choice but to fire down on the attackers, killing in some cases family members who had been rounded up from the nearby villages. The Mongol archers rained one barrage after another, but then a thundering boom strengthened the resolve of the defenders. The newly invented counterweight trebuchet was an expensive but incredibly useful measure for both offense and defense. This was one of the few instances where European military technology surpassed that of the East, and the Mongols were learning this firsthand, as not one but four of them fired upon them, outranging their own siege weapons and delivering bigger payloads. One of the stones crushed a Mongol catapult, killing several Chinese engineers, while another nearly landed on Prince Shiban himself. Their rate of fire was slow, but as long as they were operational, the Mongols couldn't effectively bombard the city's defences. Batu then ordered many of the captives to be executed and loaded on makeshift boats, which were to be sent downstream daily. The defenders could do nothing but watch the bodies float under the Judith Bridge by the hundreds. The Mongols then pushed their lines back, and only resumed their operations a week later, allowing the stone walls to be repaired. Another 2 weeks passed, littering the ground with casualties, which were used to fill the moat, but the Bohemians showed no sign of weakness. Suddenly the arrow fire ceased, as the Mongols allowed a single Ruthenian woman to scream out a message at the walls. Batu's ultimatum was directed at the Ruthenian defenders, who were told that they had 3 days to leave the city and go home, after which he would order the eradication of every Ruthenian settlement except for those who surrendered. The 4,000 Ruthenians within Prague had no idea that the Mongols were already devastating their homes, so panic began to spread. The situation was made even tenser by the fact that except for the boats, which had now become a part of daily life, the enemy made no movements. Daniel and their Bohemian allies advised that no one should surrender and that this was only a trick, so the gates remained shut. On the night of the second day, a huge brawl erupted between the Ruthenian regiments who wanted to surrender and those who wanted to fight, resulting in the loss of 220 lives, which included many citizens. The Bohemian hospitality disappeared, and both sides were not as amicable as before. Finally, Daniel, who felt responsible for his people and country, put down his arms and escorted out all but a few hundred who wished to stay behind. Daniel was immediately taken, while the rest were enslaved. A large wooden platform was built outside the range of the Bohemian trebuchets, but in full sight of the defenders, who watched as he was sealed in a giant barrel. The Mongols then handed hundreds of bottles of wine to his followers and forced them to fill it up. Daniel replaced the fermented milk he adopted with wine, and so he drowned in it. The loss of the Ruthenians was catastrophic, and added more human shields that the Mongols used to get closer and closer to the city walls. When the defenders ran out of stones, they began tearing down buildings that they could use as projectiles, even stripping the churches of their lead ceilings. The assaults raged day and night. Carts full of dry grass were pushed to the gates in order to burn them. Siege ladders were repelled as the defenders poured molten iron from the battlements. The Mongols hurled flaming bundles of sticks, soaking in human fat, which couldn't be put out by water. Despite the attacks, atrocities, hunger and disease, the defenders held out, waiting for their king to arrive. But then disaster struck. On the night of July 21st, 5 boats drifted onto the right bank, but amongst the dead lay a dozen Mongol warriors who snuck into the city and made it to the southern gate. The guards were killed, and a signal called for the advance of 500 riders, who rushed for the opening. As the gate lifted and the town bells rang, fire and fear spread within Prague. Mongol horsemen galloped through the streets, shooting at anything that moved, while more and more steppe warriors made it inside. The defenders soon realized their position was untenable, so they pulled back to the Judith Bridge, which was already full of people trying to get to the other side. Hundreds became victims of the crowd that trampled them, and eventually 4 of the 20 archers gave out and the bridge collapsed. In the commotion, a band of Ruthenian prisoners committed their final act against the Mongols by setting a huge part of their camp on fire, destroying many of their siege weapons before being put down. Batu then gave the order for the systematic sacking of the East Bank, which was raised before the eyes of Vladislaus, and captured the trebuchets. The majority of Prague, Bohemia and its defenders were destroyed. The only surviving Ruthenians were the few families Wenceslaus took with him. Europe had received a taste of what was to come if it didn't coalesce against the Horde, which was now turning its full attention to the German lands.
The Mongol punitive campaigns in Bohemia and Ruthenia in 1247 highlighted the military prowess and brutality of the Mongols, but they failed to get to the other side of the Vltava River. This bought valuable time for the Crusaders to group up and assemble at Mainz. In order to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, the elected candidate must first be crowned King of Germany, a title now bestowed by the Archbishop of Cologne to the King of Bohemia, Wenceslaus I. The event was nothing short of spectacular, as nobles from all over the empire and France gathered to witness a new chapter in history. This ceremony, seen as a distraction by some, was a crucial legitimacy boost, aimed at earning the allegiance of those who had not yet joined the Crusade. Indeed, a large portion of the princes didn't actually support the current emperor Frederick, but were merely enemies of his enemies. For a brief moment, the attendees could make toasts, participate in tourneys, and plan their next moves, aimed at repelling the invasion that could no longer be ignored. But there were still those who saw the French as foreign invaders and Wenceslaus as anti-king. Indulgences weren't as popular as before, and crusades passing through Germany often led to violence, massacres, and sackings. The countermeasure was carefully thought out by a council of crusaders and aimed at quickly solidifying the unity of the empire by targeting the most valuable targets. The goal of the groups, led by the leaders later called the 12 Legates, was to collect more manpower and resources for the crusade by spreading the word about the Mongol atrocities, papal decree, and imperial coronation. If legitimacy and faith failed to do their part, then the legates would resort to violence. One way or another, the Pope would make sure that the Imperial Alliance would stand as one against the Horde. The dark news from Prague made the council give up hope on saving Bohemia, but Louis's own brother, Robert of Artois, was sent out with 500 knights and their retinue to evacuate as many people as possible before it was too late. Henry II of Nassau, who had already built 3 castles, left for Nuremberg and Regensburg with the funds and supplies required to significantly improve their defences. The 2 cities would act as a base of operations, which Louis IX also headed with the bulk of the Crusaders. The 4th commander was none other than Theobald of Navarre, who spearheaded a campaign in Swabia, the ancestral home of Frederick himself. 3 other commanders were immediately sent out to secure the crucial Alpine passes and support Italy. Alphonse of Poitiers was to put an end to the disputes of Lorraine and then join Charles of Anjou, who had already begun to attack one of Frederick's greatest allies, Amadeus IV of Savoy. King James of Aragon, on the other hand, left with his army and armada to sail to Rome, in an effort to start a campaign against the excommunicated former emperor. Back in Germany, many princes departed, hoping to gain valuable allies or overthrow key enemies. Otto I of Brunswick headed to Mecklenburg to bring an end to its civil war. Albert I of Saxony rode north to Holstein and Denmark to bring them into the fold. William of Holland was tasked with unifying Flanders. Wenceslaus agreed to lead an army towards Jülich and Gelders, and finally Henry Raspe made his way to Meissen. The hope was to complete each mission within a year, while the French held the line against the Mongols, using the terrain and a series of fortifications to stall them. Louis didn't want to just save the empire, but return it to the glory days of Charlemagne. Back in the east, the rubber band tactic of invade, destroy, withdraw until the winter was now in effect, as Batu ordered his soldiers to pick up the loot and captives and regroup in the Great Hungarian Plain. Poland and Hungary had lost half of their populations, but those who remained were obedient and even loyal to their Mongol overlords, who created a new chain of command entirely dependent on them. Darachi, or tax collectors, were appointed in important cities, acting as overseers and representatives of the Khan, while small bands of warriors acted as a police force, solving disputes between minor and major lords. As for the Rus, Subotai sent Alexander Nevsky back to Novgorod in order to organize a council, tasked with the election of the next Grand Prince, one subservient to Batu first and the Great Khan second. Some of the Mongol princes and generals wanted to go back home, but there was still unfinished business. Prague was still standing, Wenceslaus still drew breath, and an extremely arrogant pope who sent an envoy to Karakorum asking the Khan to convert to Christianity continued to oppose them. And so, on November 13, 1247, the Mongols launched a new offensive, fanning out to cover as much territory as possible, with the main army poised against Prague, with 2 smaller forces, a single 2 men strong, in the north and south. This time, the force was made up entirely of Mongol warriors, while the auxiliary tributary forces waited until early spring to join them. Surprisingly, once they got to the other side of the Vistula River, they discovered that western Bohemia was evacuated. Subotai went ahead with no more than 4,000 horse archers, tracking what looked to be a large caravan heading west. Before long, a scout reported that a massive convoy was spotted heading toward Thuringia. The Mongols rode through the night and intercepted the baggage train, shocking the heirs of France and Bohemia, Robert and Wenceslaus, near Jena. The French prince was eager for a fight, so he ordered his 500 cavalry to charge alongside him. The Mongols attempted to execute their classic feigned retreat, but their mounts were exhausted, allowing the French to catch up to them and do what they did best. Several hundred steppe warriors were butchered, but Subotai still had the numeric advantage, so he carefully began encircling his enemy. Emboldened by his success, Robert ordered another charge, but the second one was less effective than the first. The terrain made maneuvering the heavy beasts difficult. Once they were completely surrounded, Subotai ordered his men to switch to whistling arrows, terrifying the French horses, who began throwing and trampling their riders. Once Robert was killed, all cohesion fell apart, and the men began scattering in all directions. The Mongols then chased them down through the deep woods. The news was mixed. Subotai reported that the convoy had escaped, thanks to Robert's sacrifice. But still, the Battle of Jena was a notable victory that brought many spoils. Upon examination, it was clear that Robert was of a high rank, as his banner was recognized by one of the Bohemian captives the Mongols used as guides. At that moment, Batu knew that he would be facing a powerful coalition. the main force withdrew behind the Bohemian mountains, guarding the two passes near Chomutov and Usti nad Labem, while sending out 100 Zuns, or groups of 100 Mongol warriors. Each group was given a letter, a bag of silver, and a sack of skulls to present to any settlement they encountered. The German forests were thick and rivers deep, and it was better to rely on a smaller but more mobile force. Subotai took another 1,000 riders and created a base of operations, constantly exchanging information with these smaller groups and replenishing them with supplies and spare mounts. This scouting expedition coincided with the Western attempts to rein in the Holy Roman Empire, which were for the most part successful but took time. Zuns began encountering and carefully examining the particular features of Germany. The wide network of rivers was hard to traverse, but key bridges were located. Initially, most of the princes were still loyal to Frederick, who had instructed them to stay in their keeps and not engage the Mongols in open combat. The small packs of units could do little to harass said keeps, but the German villages had little more than a church to hide in. Some surrendered, others were burned down, and with each passing day, more and more information was gathered at Subotai's camp. The most crucial piece of information had to do with the severe decentralization in the Holy Roman Empire. Though it made installing a single puppet to rule over this land difficult, it also meant that the fortifications the Mongols saw were often little more than outposts, usually built in forward areas in order to control valuable trade routes or oversee a population area. Most of it lived on the western side of the Rhine, with the northern German plain, dense with woodlands and swamps, being sparsely populated. The greatest fortifications of the medieval world, such as Crac de Chevalier, Dover Castle, Carcassonne, Alhambra, and many other wonders of engineering, required years of hard labor, finance, and most of all stability. The empire didn't have a capital or a single dynasty that could build such castles. Instead, it was littered with thousands of small keeps and outposts, while most cities had a single wall surrounding them. Italian city-states could afford bigger walls and keeps, but the same levels of decentralization hindered the size of their castles. As the months passed and the riders rode further north, some of them began to be ambushed by eager crusaders. Some groups were lost, but those who survived relayed the information to the base camp. The solution was simple and swift. In December 1247, the skies of Germany were black with smoke from the hundreds of forest fires the Mongols started. The tactic was effective, but it also acted as yet another unifying factor for the divided empire. Yet still, two of these groups were secretly invited to a meeting with Otto of Brandenburg. He was the younger of two Ascanian brothers who jointly ruled the Margrave for the last 27 years, but he saw this as an opportunity to become its sole ruler. The Mongols were eager to help in this ploy, so they stormed the small keep of his rivals alongside the Brandenburg forces. Once inside, the two brothers played their hand and slaughtered the outmaneuvered and dismounted outsiders, scoring a small but symbolic victory. That success was overshadowed by the disaster that soon followed. Henry Raspe, who was tasked with securing the crucial Margraviate of Meissen, was in the middle of a siege after its lord Henry had refused him. When the Sun of Mongols discovered the Thuringian army, they quickly reported to Subotai. What followed could hardly be called a battle. The besiegers were cold, hungry, and stuck between the walls of Meissen and the hail of Mongol arrows. Few escaped from the carnage, and Henry Raspe was not among them. The other legates were far more successful. Holstein, Denmark, Guelders, Lorraine, and Flanders were added to the coalition. Nuremberg and Regensburg were fortified and converted into powerful centers of operation. Emperor Wenceslaus was reunited with his sons and what was left of his people. Half of Swabia was put under the leadership of Rudolf I of the relatively obscure House Habsburg. The ambitious ruler, who had previously used bribery and assassination to rise, had the full backing of the French king and campaigned alongside Theobald of Navarre. Other regions, however, still resisted the Seventh Crusade, and the Mecklenburg squabble couldn't be resolved diplomatically, Jülich resisted, and Charles had a difficult time campaigning in the mountainous region of Savoy. Finally, James I safely made it to Rome with his 180 ships, carrying 20,000 Aragonese troops, and now only waited until the early summer to make his way south. It was there in Naples where a man nicknamed the Antichrist by the Pope was writing the most influential letter in history. Frederick had devoted his life to serving his subjects. He was excommunicated for not going on a crusade while he was ill, then excommunicated again after liberating Jerusalem via peaceful means. The Templars plotted to kill him. His vassals succeeded in supplanting him. His endless warnings against the Mongols were always met with ridicule. Instead, the Pope called for a crusade against the Rus while they were being invaded. And now a French army was marching towards his ancestral home and threatening his 20-year-old son Conrad, who was on the other side of the Alps. Frederick knew that even if he were to join the crusade, his reign was at an end, that he would only make yet another sacrifice in vain. So he did the unthinkable. He wrote to Batu. In the letter, swiftly delivered to the Mongol camp, Frederick offered terms. He would open up the Alpine passes his vassals held into Italy, and urge the citizens of the empire to submit to the Mongols, as long as the atrocities came to a stop. Germany was burning, and Bohemia was a graveyard, so perhaps diplomacy was the only way to stop this menace. In order for this to happen, Frederick had one condition. The Mongols had to deliver his son to him safely. Should the Mongols fail in escorting Conrad, then the border guards would not let them through. Prior to receiving the letter, the Mongols knew that traversing the Alps or taking over Bavaria would be extremely costly, so when the offer was made, Batu immediately pounced on it. Baiju Noyan was sent with 500 of the swiftest warriors the horde had to offer, in order to secure Conrad before he was attacked by the forces of the alliance. In the meantime, Batu gathered 2 tumens and readied them for the upcoming campaign. Frederick's son also received a letter asking him to trust these heathens with his life. Along the way, Baiju was ambushed twice, but each time his men were able to fend off the attackers and continue toward their objective. The meeting with Conrad and his retinue was tense, but the translators were able to reassure both sides that they had a common goal. With him in their custody, the Mongols could offer letters with his seal to the key supporters in Bavaria, Tyrol, Como and Trent. Crossing the Alps during the winter was dangerous, but the small group safely made it through the friendly territory and arrived in Verona in early February 1248. During the next 2 months, the Mongols scouted out the 3 possible routes through the mountains, waiting for the right time for Batu and his 20,000 men to make it across, leaving Subotai in charge of the Germanic campaign. The Mongols had traversed numerous mountains in the last few decades, but the Alps were still one of the most formidable defenses in the world, one that they now conquered, losing only 1,200 men to frostbite in the process. A handful of well-trained men who knew the passes and how to defend them could stop even the largest army, yet now the floodgates were open and thousands of riders made their way into the Po Valley unopposed. Batu made sure his men didn't resort to raiding, for Emperor Frederick had kept his word, and he would do the same. Brescia, Verona, Mantua, Ferrara and Ravenna all paid homage to the Mongols. The riders stopped to feed themselves and their mounts, and quietly went on their way, heading toward Rome. Traveling merchants who witnessed the dust cloud formed by the army spread rumors, which quickly made their way to the Holy City, where James of Aragon was dumbfounded, as he didn't expect an army to be able to invade from the north. For a moment, he contemplated retreating back to Iberia, but looking at the ancient wonders of Rome, the very heart of Christendom itself, he made the decision to stand his ground. Calls for help were sent across Italy, urging volunteers to come to the aid of the papacy, while his fleet left for Provence, hoping to reach Charles of Anjou in time so that he may reinforce his desperate position. Rome was a shadow of its former self, its main protection being symbolic. Only a quarter of the space within its Aurelian walls was populated, and most of the defences were now in ruins. Every able-bodied man was trained by the Aragonese army, while women crafted arrows. Nearby forests were cut or burned, and every rock large enough to be a projectile was broken up into smaller pieces. The Pope bestowed blessings on the walls while they were being repaired, and everyone prayed for help to arrive. On April 22, 1248, 21 Genoan ships came to Rome's aid, carrying supplies, craftsmen, and 1,000 crossbowmen. In the next week, a few hundred more men arrived from Ancona, but just as the mood began to turn, the dust cloud was seen in the distance. Upon his arrival on May 5th, Batu was not impressed by the state of the city he had been told so much about, though signs of activity were apparent as the defenders scrambled to fortify their position in any way they could. On the next day, dozens of arrows flew inside the city, carrying parchments urging the defenders to surrender. The defenders then picked up the arrows, removed the letters, and fired them back. The siege of Rome had begun. For the next 2 weeks, the Mongols ventured further out in search of wood and demolished the suburbs outside the walls in an effort to build siege ladders while trying to find a weak spot in the defences. The walls possessed 383 towers, 18 gates, and 5 postern gates, each of them manned by a sizable force, with 10 men per tower. Day and night, the attackers tried to find an opening, setting up their siege ladder under the cover of protective shields and arrow fire, but each time the defenders were able to repel them. Priests patrolled the wall, boosting the morale of the defenders, while also giving the last rites of the unfortunate ones who were shot. Batu failed to anticipate the Aragonese army and was in a race against time. Not only was the possibility of a relief army real, but the absence from the German front threatened the entire campaign. Unfortunately for him, his Chinese engineers were left behind, allowing the mounted army to move quicker towards their destination, and without them, the Mongols weren't able to build mangonels, let alone more sophisticated devices and other weapons. The defenders, on the other hand, were able to build siege weapons of their own, with the help of the Genoese craftsmen. But what they didn't have was an endless supply of food. James did his best to build up a stockpile, and rationing was put into place. Still, with an army of 20,000, as well as another 25,000 Roman citizens, the city could only last for a few more months, even with access to the Tiber River. Assaults on the now completely encircled city continued to fail until June 12th, when help finally came, this time from the north. Ezzelino III d'Aramano, ruler of Verona, Vicenza and Padua, charged straight for the Mongol camp. The defenders lined up on the walls, witnessing Batu's men flee the scene in an awful panic. The makeshift palisade was set on fire, alongside the marvelous tent of Batu Khan. A stampede ensued as thousands of horse riders fled south, abandoning the siege amidst Mongol screams and Christian cheers. James ordered all of his 800 knights to give chase and cut down as many of them as they could while they were in disarray. The 5,600 men under Ezzelino then entered the city through the Portia Salaria, celebrated as triumphant heroes. However, the Veronese ruler insisted that the fight was far from over and offered his aid in the protection of the Eternal City. The Pope and Aragonese king were not expecting help from Ezzelino, who had a terrible reputation as a cruel tyrant, but the defenders were so desperate that they welcomed it without reservations. Indeed, only 2 hours later, the Mongols had returned, but there was no remnant of the knights who were sent out against them. The horde was mindlessly charging against the walls, and then history changed forever. The gates of San Sebastiano and San Paolo quickly opened. Ezzelino personally stabbed James and threw him over the battlements, and thousands of Mongols rushed into the city. One by one, the rest of the gates began to open up as the Italian traitors killed the guards, executing the predetermined plan with brutal efficiency. As more and more defenders were called on from the other portions of the walls, Ezzelino's men remained at their posts, making sure the rest of the gates were locked, trapping everyone else. Quarter by quarter, alley by alley, the Mongol wraith swept it all away. Resistance collapsed amidst the multi-pronged assault, and there was nothing anyone could do against the vicious and systematic destruction. A last-ditch effort was made by the Genoese, who turned the Colosseum into a fortress, managing to hold on for 6 more hours, while the rest of the city was violently plundered. The Mongols were ordered not to harm the Pope or the cardinals, but instead bring them to Batu in chains. Innocent IV hid on the top floor of the Tower of the Capocci, but eventually he was captured. Batu had promised to spare Rome once the Pope was in his custody, but in his eyes this was a symbol of arrogance that had to be brought down. The numerous obelisks brought in from Egypt were torn down, oxen were gathered and pulled down the columns of the Parthenon. men pushed over priceless statues and marble works in the Forum, desecrated some of the most beautiful churches in Christendom, destroyed Hadrian's mausoleum and baths of Caracalla, and finally, once they had made their way into the Colosseum, Batu invited his troops to witness the end of the papacy within the Colosseum. Golden and marble trophies displaying the peak of the ancient world were scattered across the arena. Pope Innocent was then brought before the audience, and Batu began his speech.
Behold a man elevated by his own arrogance and strung up by avarice. He who dares to think himself righteous as he stands against the will of heaven will not find safety behind the walls of an empire long dead, clinging pridefully to the deeds of ill-remembered men. For heaven has given this land and all the face of the earth to Chinggis Khan and his progeny. Therefore we have purified the world of grave sins and massacred justly, bringing low many kingdoms of might and majesty. Those who resisted us sealed their own fate, along with that of their wives, children, and kith and kin. Our hearts are like stone, and our armies as numerous as the sand. Let this city burn and rot as a testament to the unyielding will of heaven.
With these words, Innocent was executed. Ezzelino and his men were richly rewarded for their assistance in what we now call the Death of Antiquity. Within 44 years, the brutal sacks of both Rome and Constantinople erased not just the most beautiful and valuable works of art, not just endless tomes of histories never to be read again, but the very foundation of Christendom itself. The Pope and his cardinals were no more. The remaining Christians were shaken to their very core. What hope remained was now in the hands of France and their German allies. But could they do the impossible? Or was it only a matter of time until this carnage reached the cities of Cologne, Milan, and Paris? It is easy to look at the Mongols and reduce them to a savage horde that excelled at warfare. And yet it was their diplomatic maneuvering, military intelligence, and psychological warfare that allowed them to ally Frederick II, sneak through the Alps, and raze Rome to the ground. By June 1248, central Italy immediately submitted to Frederick, who wanted to keep the news of the calamity and his alliance a secret. Messengers were caught, and the Alpine passes were closed, but the Aragonese Armada would eventually make it back to Provence. But until then, the forces of the Seventh Crusade still had to contend with the 50,000 Mongols who were ready to rampage through Germany after gathering information about its rivers, forests, and fortifications. While Batu was besieging Rome, events were transpiring to the north. The Mongol command was split into 3 camps, each of which had its own plan for conducting the campaign, which by all accounts wouldn't be easy. Batu's brothers, Berka and Shiban, represented the interests of the Jochids. Kadan was the brother of Khan Ogedei, while Subotai had the most experience. After 3 long years, attrition had taken its toll, and some wanted to return to the steppe, while others wanted to vanquish their enemies with haste, rather than prolong the campaign even further. Eventually, the princes decided to divide themselves into 3 large groups, each with a specific mission, based on the topography of the region and its political situation. Meissen was the only major city that submitted to the Mongols in northern Germany, a fealty now reaffirmed by the alliance with Frederick, since its ruler Henry was firmly in the imperial camp. However, the death of Henry Rasper had major implications for Thuringia, since he had no heirs to succeed him as Landgrave. Henry of Meissen was the son of Rasper's older sister Jutta, and the Mongols were more than happy to help him solidify his claim over one of the most important countries in the empire. This task was to be carried out by the first group, which was 20,000 strong and led by Kadan and Berka. The second group, a 2-men strong, led by Shiban, aimed at Brandenburg, a margraviate, a county on the frontier of the empire, which had recently risen to become one of its powerful states thanks to the Ascanian brothers. Willingly or reluctantly, the Polish king Boleslav the Horned had agreed to assist the horde in the second phase of the expansion to this side of the empire, but only after Shiban had leveled any inhabited settlement that refused to kneel. The last group, composed of another 20,000, had a similar mission, only pointing north towards the most powerful region in the north, Brunswick. Afterwards, Subotai was to lay siege to the well-fortified cities of Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck and Schleswig. The campaign had slowed for various reasons, but now the Mongols would use the intel they had gathered and combine it with their mobility and ferociousness in order to decimate the entirety of North and East Germany in less than a year. Apart from gathering information, the Mongol scouting units had also achieved two crucial objectives. They had secured the surrender of some smaller towns that provided local guides, supplies, and small pockets of control, so the Mongols could fall back in case of trouble. Secondly, more Germans had grown confident from their minor victorious ambushes. The tales of Teutoburg Forest and the heroism of Arminius were told around campfires as opportunistic volunteer groups lurked in the forests. But this time, the nomads came in force and didn't bother performing feigned retreats. The assault began on March 8, 1248, and it was brutal and catastrophic. Chroniclers recorded what they believed to be the end times, as village after village was sacked. These lands were sparsely populated, dotted with small outposts that didn't stand a chance. Townsfolk locked themselves inside churches, praying for hope and salvation, only for them to be burned down or torn down upon them. Any settlements that surrendered were spared, but those that even showed a sign of resistance were culled. One of the massive wagons transporting the Mongol yurts would park next to the town square, and every male member who didn't possess a useful trade was forced to walk beside it. If their head extended above the linchpin or center of the wheel, they were taken aside and immediately executed. The rest were enslaved. Notably, the considerable Jewish population, which had previously suffered widespread pogroms, fled to the Mongols in droves. Provided they stayed loyal to their new overlords, they were escorted east and given a new home. Magdeburg, the loyalist city surrounded by enemies, swiftly surrendered, but Brandenburg and Brunswick were wiped off the map. Louis had been worried by the rumor that Batu was moving south, and failed to anticipate or even react to the blitz that Subotai had executed. Otto of Brunswick, Albert of Saxony, and John of Ascania, accompanied by anyone who could afford a fast horse, made it to the safety of the Rhine and detailed the destruction of the rest of the legates. But John decided to stay, making a desperate stand at Brandenburg. Legend has it that he took down 12 Mongol riders while an arrow was sticking out of his head before he went down, earning him the nickname Johann mit dem Pfeil, or John with the Arrow. The first stage was complete, and while infantry from Poland and Meissen moved into the empire, the Mongols kept pressing the advantage by attacking Mecklenburg, Lüneburg, and rich merchant cities in the north. When Subotai rode in front of Lüneburg, one of the most powerful centers east of the Rhine, the horror stories were already circulating the cities, and its defenders decided to take no chances and surrendered. A small garrison was posted on the walls, provisions were replenished, and on the 6th of May, the Mongols marched towards Hamburg. This time, however, the citizens of the empire resisted, so siege lines were drawn. The first 2 days were quiet, with neither skirmishes nor assaults from either side. The Mongols didn't employ sappers or build barricades, and on the third day, the defenders of Hamburg quickly found out why. The European trebuchet design was copied after the Mongols seized several of them in the aftermath of the siege of Prague. The giant mechanical contraption that the Chinese engineers built fired its first shot, but it missed. The second went over the walls and smashed into a city house, but the third took down an entire tower. There was nothing the defenders could do, outnumbered at least 100 to 1, and with no means to stop this war machine from firing, they waved the white flag, hoping they would get the same treatment Lüneburg did. But Subotai was not in a forgiving mood. His code of honor demanded that a city be spared only if it surrendered outright, and since Hamburg attempted to resist, the Mongols sacked it once they were safely inside. Another great city was conquered, and its bridges allowed the Mongols to cross the wide Elbe River. Now the greatest prize of the north, Lübeck, was within their grasp. The terrain was taking its toll, and the heavy wagons often got stuck on the muddy paths. The convenience of old Roman roads was gone, but a huge portion of Subotai's army began to move east. Around 5,000 of his men were sent west in order to take the last major stronghold in the area, which was Bremen, while Shiban and the majority of his 2 men pressed onward and broke the heavily fragmented Mecklenburg, sacking Rostock in the process. When 15,000 Mongols neared Lübeck, they were stunned by what they encountered. Frederick II declared Lübeck to be a free city in 1226, and soon after they developed one of the most influential city constitutions, second only to that of Magdeburg. The small city lay on the mouth of the river Trave, neatly packed into an island, with high walls and only 5 access points, 4 severed. After the Mongols conquered the lands of the Teutonic Knights, many of them returned home, knowing full well the destruction the horde was capable of. Despite the hundreds of cities they encountered over the thousands of miles they galloped through, the Mongols had never seen such a town. Lübeck could not be fully blockaded without a navy, and while Subotai had many advantages, he didn't have a fleet. On the other side, 2 of the legates managed to hold up on the mercantile island. Otto of Brunswick and Albert of Saxony and their retinue accounted for a third of the 3,000 defenders. Another 1,000 were made up of mercenaries the city council could afford, with the remainder comprised of farmers, craftsmen, traders, and any man strong enough to hold a spear or pull a bow. Similarly to Lüneburg, the Mongols began assembling their trebuchets and set up a containment area around the city. Neighbouring Ratzeburg, Neumünster, Kiel and Wismar were attacked. Despite some of them surrendering, the Mongols broke through their wooden walls and sacked the cities. For Lübeck to be taken, live captives were required. Some would dig ditches, others were to be tortured in front of the city walls, and others still were to be used as projectiles. On April 23rd, the bombardment began. Giant rocks, some doused in flammable liquids and set on fire before release, smashed into the walls and interior of Lübeck. Using the forced labour of their captives, the Mongols made efforts to divert and dam the river, but their attempts were unsuccessful, costing the lives of hundreds of peasants who couldn't swim. Boulders fell from the sky day and night, one of which tore down the beautiful brick-built Lübeck Cathedral. After a week of desperation, the tide suddenly turned. Dozens of horns blew, attracting the gaze of the Mongols and imperial citizens alike toward the north. Danish and Norwegian banners flew upon the masts of over 100 vessels. Help had finally arrived. The Scandinavian rivals had put their grievances aside and now sailed as one under the leadership of the mighty Norwegian king Håkon IV. His 200 ships were accompanied by another 50 from Denmark, Holstein, Rügen and Gotland. Subotai ordered his siege crews to focus their fire on the ships, and stones began flying towards them. However, since they were approaching from the north, where only one of the trebuchets was positioned, they only managed to sink 2 ships. Hundreds of warriors bravely jumped into the fray, while volley after volley of arrows was fired against them. The fleet hugged the city from both sides, and skirmishes were started in virtually every corner of the blockade. Subotai had a difficult choice to make. Despite the marshy terrain, he could attempt a feigned retreat and pull his forces back, but at the cost of his trebuchets. The 72-year-old commander weighed his options and decided that he wanted a decisive battle where he could destroy his enemies before they could run back to their ships. Norse warriors met the composite bow and heavy lances of the greatest cavalry army the world had ever seen, and the fighting was intense. Scattered groups engaged each other in combat wherever they met, but the most intense fighting was centered around the 4 trebuchets. Håkon personally led his men and managed to take one of them, quickly burning it in order to save Lübeck. Witnessing this, Subotai took his bodyguards and reinforced another trebuchet, which now fired at the anchored ships. At this point, the army of the defenders also sallied out of the only remaining bridge to join the fight. The ground was wet and slippery, forcing many of the Mongols to dismount and fire against the endless waves of warriors. It was at that moment that the valiant Yaramar, Prince of Rugen, charged at one of the most accomplished commanders in history after his raiding party created an opening amidst the guard. All it took was one perfect axe throw that met his skull. Subotai fell down from his horse, sending waves of panic through the steppe riders. All but one of the trebuchets had already been taken or destroyed, and without their brilliant leader, the Mongols began to flee the battlefield. After 3 hours of ferocious combat and over 4,000 allied dead, the city of Lübeck was saved. It would take just over 10 days for Subotai's body to be delivered to Thuringia, and by that time the main campaign had begun. While Subotai, Shiban, Batu and Charles of Anjou were on all of their separate campaigns, the main forces of the two camps were considering their next defining move. Louis, who wasn't aware of the situation in central Italy, carefully considered every option, but in the end, his council decided to fall back, since the risk of allowing the Mongols to cross the Rhine was too great. Rome and the north were in danger, and a small garrison could hold Regensburg and Nuremberg, so the only thing the army of the 7th Crusade could do was protect the prosperous zone around Mainz, Frankfurt, Nassau, Cologne and Worms. But once they had made it to Mainz, Louis was inspired by one of the letters the Mongols were circulating, urging their enemies to surrender, bearing the seal of Bavaria. Several poems and chronicles recounting this story allude to Louis writing a taunting letter, but its exact message has been lost. In any case, the French king taunted Kadan, mocking his pagan god and challenging him to meet him in battle outside the city of the Franks, Frankenfurt. Kadan was unsure of what to make of this, but Berke was restless. He wanted to avenge the death of his older brother Orda, and Wenceslaus evaded them until now. So the letter, or rumour that he had become the new Holy Roman Emperor, made a strong impression on the Mongol prince. Eventually the two agreed to accept this invitation and gathered their tumens for the most impactful battle of the Middle Ages. The Mongols could only field 16,000, as many were left to guard Thuringia. Henry of Meissen gave the commanders many maps and deep knowledge of the region, and smaller parties began to test the region, tasked specifically with locating the best possible crossing of their main geographical obstacle, the Fulda River. During this time of the year, the water level was high enough to present a natural blockade, but after using the familiar sacks of bones and coin, the Mongols were able to secure the allegiance of the town that bore the name of the river itself, Fulda. After assembling, the nomads carefully began advancing towards Frankfurt, which was no further than a week's march away. Scouting parties were sent ahead of the main army. A few of them went missing, while the rest showed no signs of the enemy. Villages were abandoned, and there was no sign of activity along the narrow stretch we now call the Fulda Gap. But then, on April 26, 1248, a forward unit rushed back to the camp. The banners of both Emperor Wenceslaus and King Louis were spotted, and the Crusaders were camped on a hill next to the tiny town of Buddingen, 40 kilometers away from Frankfurt and the heart of the empire. Everything the Mongols wanted was now right in front of them, and they didn't have to endure a prolonged siege to seize it. Each of the two leaders formed a separate wing, while most heavy lancers were positioned in the middle. Ahead of them stood the armies of Louis, Wenceslaus, William of Holland, Hugh IV of Burgundy, Peter of Brittany, and numerous detachments from various imperial cities. Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, Worms, Trier, Koblenz, Speyer, Strasbourg, Regensburg, Habsburg, and Münster had all banded together for a desperate last stand against the horses of the apocalypse, as many called them. Combined, the forces of the 7th Crusade numbered 22,000, of which 3,200 were knights, 6,000 were crossbowmen, and the rest infantry. This was the largest force assembled by the West since the Third Crusade, and it was highly motivated. Wenceslaus had lost his home, Louis had lost his brother, and everyone had heard the horrific news of what the pagan Mongols did with those who defied them. The Christians built makeshift fortifications, planted spikes, and laid thousands of caltrops. Wenceslaus held the centre with the majority of the ranged units. Louis commanded the right, with over half of the heavy mounted knights. William of Holland held the left, while Hugh held the rear. After a prolonged stare-down, the Mongols initiated the battle with a caracole maneuver. Groups of horse archers would ride out, fire at the enemy formations, and then fall back. Usually this would be executed flawlessly, with neatly organised formations that didn't collide or slow each other down. But the rugged terrain, combined with caltrops in front of the Crusader formation, not only reduced their effectiveness, but also made them more vulnerable to the bolts fired by the Crusader crossbowmen. Each fallen horseman made the terrain more difficult to maneuver, and after an hour of trying to soften the defenders, the Mongols decided to switch their strategy. Twice the feigned retreat was performed, and twice the enemy didn't take the bait. But on the third attempt, there was a massive collision that dominoed through a large section of the steppe riders. The attack was called off, but Wenceslaus saw his opportunity and charged alongside his army. Louis and William didn't move, so the centre moved forward, exposing itself in order to take advantage of the momentary Mongol weakness. The fighting was brutal, and Berke immediately threw himself at the opportunity. Heavy lancers charged head-on, while the horse archers tried to execute open-the-end tactics, encircling various pockets of enemy infantry, with one easy-to-spot escape route intentionally placed by the skilled hunters. The Bohemian vanguard held the line, with raised shields, as more and more Mongols poured in. Some men panicked, but under the cover of the allied crossbows, many maintained their forward position. Fearing that this could turn ugly, Kadan also charged in with his men, hoping to bring a swift end to the battle. It was in that moment that Louis IX turned to his men.
Brothers, men of good character and strong will, we have left our great kingdom to stand before the screaming hordes of evil. There are many sins committed in warfare, but today our Lord has judged you to be his righteous archangels. On this day our Lord has sent us adversity. But banish all unrest from your hearts. Put on the full armor of God, so that we may take our stand against the devil's schemes. Out there, beyond this plain, is the door to the kingdom of heaven. So I conjure and require you to ride. Ride with me, and we shall deliver his reckoning and his vengeance.
As the French knights began their charge, Kadan ordered his troops to fall back, but Berke continued to fight, desperately trying to find Wenceslaus. Seeing as he wasn't going to follow any orders, Kadan instead broke away and galloped straight into Louis. At this point, William also joined, sending his troops to the centre. The Crusaders tried to squeeze the Mongols, but even with the terrain, bodies of men and horses, and caltrops, the riders were able to maneuver all around them, firing from every direction. This giant melee made it difficult for the crossbowmen to be effective, and many of them decided to draw swords and get into the action. Both sides were taking heavy casualties, and in the midst of the battle, Berke finally managed to reach the Bohemian banner. He personally killed several of the bodyguards and the person he thought was Wenceslaus. In reality, the Emperor was still at the back with the reserve. His standard was the perfect bait, merely one of the many traps the Westerners had devised. And it was at that very moment when the next one came into play. While the battle was playing out, Henry, who ruled Nassau and knew the region, alongside Theobald of Navarre, who knew his way around highlands, were holding up in the nearby Volgersberg mountain, hidden amongst the trees. Once the battle had started, a messenger was sent out to find them, and now they had caught up and appeared at the Mongol rear. Seeing this, Berke gathered every rider he could and tried to charge right at them. However, at this point, most of the cohesion was gone. Mongol heavy lancers met their match as they smashed against the French knights. Kadan himself was injured in his shoulder, but kept on moving against Louis. Many of the horse archers, who managed to evade the press of the Crusader left and centre, were now coming to his aid and encircling the right. They aimed for the weaknesses in the knights' armor and their mounts. It was then that one of Louis's bodyguards tumbled in front of him. The horse of the French king came to a sudden stop, and he flew out of his saddle. The impact broke his left arm, but he drew his sword with his right and held his ground. An avalanche of nomads began to attack, desperate to land a blow on the monarch, while his loyal guard did their best to hold firm. All momentum stopped as both sides pushed towards the center, one attacking and the other defending. Louis fought bravely, refusing to be carried away, until a hooked lance struck him in the neck. The king was dead within seconds. Struck with grief, the French knights carried on the fight valiantly, with Peter of Brittany assuming command. Kadan threw everything into the assault and paid the price. One moment, the Mongol leader and brother of Khan Ogedei was giving out orders. In the next, a French knight struck him in the back of the head with a mace, killing him instantly. Kadan was second in command after Batu, and with his death, panic began to spread. Berke had failed to cause significant damage to Henry and Theobald, so he rode northeast back to Thuringia. Many attempted to do the same, but the Fulda Gap was narrow, leaving few openings for a tactical retreat. Back at Fulda, the citizens had been evacuated, and a group of Nassau knights held the crossing. Berke was trapped, his army was exhausted, morale disintegrated, and it was every Mongol for himself. Chased down by the Crusaders, who were filled with anger and adrenaline, a few thousand survivors scattered in the German mountains. Of the 16,000 Mongols, nearly the entire force was vanquished, except for the 2,000 riders who managed to escape alongside Berke. The Crusaders, on the other hand, only lost 5,400, with Louis IX among them. The timely arrival of the Norwegian fleet saved Lubeck, while the Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of the Fulda Gap repelled the main force of the horde. The Mongols north of the Alps were scattered and leaderless. The armies of Shiban and Berke, or at least what was left of them, turned into murderous bands of pillagers who viciously looted small villages. Emperor Wenceslaus urged the Crusaders to press on and finish the job, but without Louis, the French army refused to march any further. The 21-year-long reign of the man now called Saint Louis was nothing short of astonishing. A paragon of virtue, lawfulness, and courage that many volunteered to follow in life and in death. A giant host of French and German troops and civilians slowly made their way back to Paris, led by his widow Margaret of Provence. The Queen Regent hosted a huge funeral procession, attended by most of the French nobility and a few English nobles, most notably Richard, the Earl of Cornwall, who was married to her sister Sonkia, and King Henry VIII, who married her sister Eleanor. As per his request, Louis's entrails were placed in an urn at Notre Dame, his heart was left in Frankfurt, and his body was buried at the Basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris. Margaret crowned Europe's saviour with the crown of thorns he had purchased from Constantinople, kissed him through her seal, and sealed his tomb. A week of mourning was declared in the city, and while people wept, Margaret whispered in the ears of her fellow lords. But while alliances and schemes were being hatched, Rome was calling out for aid. Batu's siege had begun just 4 days after the battle, and in June 1248, the city had fallen thanks to the betrayal of Ezzelino III de Romano, causing a shockwave that spread through the Christian world. The King of Aragon lost his life defending the city, and Pope Innocent IV was executed at the Colosseum. Rumors spread like wildfire, with many preachers fanning the flames of panic and hysteria. People spoke of the end times, and outside of Castile and France, many Catholic and Orthodox Christians believed that the battle in Germany was Armageddon itself. After the first Mongol invasion in 1242, famine and plague already began to spread and ravage the population. With this second and much larger invasion, starvation was even more rampant. Noble lords held up in their castle manors and stockpiled as much food as they could get their hands on, leaving the lower classes to starve or resort to brigandry. Trade collapsed, and many craftsmen were left without a trade. Emigration from the North German plain was so widespread that entire communities relocated and founded new towns on the western bank of the Rhine, such as Markgrafenberg, Termach, and Kölner Neustadt, while new Jewish settlers moved to the now devastated Bohemia to found towns like Zerminger and Yeshua. In the winter of 1248, combining these factors would result in a catastrophic wave of peasant rebellions, aimed primarily at the clergy, as desperate mobs would start tearing down decadent churches and selling off gold and silver ornaments for bread and onions. The papal state was the centrifugal force that kept the delicate balance and established a form of universal Christian code. With the Pope out of the picture, there was a spiritual and secular power vacuum, and the first state that attempted to fill that void was one that managed to stay neutral through these events. The Venetian Republic was founded by survivors of Aquileia after Attila the Hun razed it to the ground in 752. Even after almost a millennia, its inhabitants kept the memory alive and had no sympathies for the Mongol horde, nor did they shed too many tears for the fall of the papacy. Better than most, they understood the coming crisis. The invasions would rapidly decrease trade, raise inflation, and cause mass migration to the city, which was already overpopulated, with over 80,000 citizens who had no direct access to fresh water. The Council of 40, called the Quarentia, convened for an emergency meeting on July 22, 1248, where the acting Doge, Jacopo Tiepolo, voluntarily resigned in favour of the newly elected Raniero Zeno, who was skilled in warfare and an open rival to the papacy in the past. After 5 days of heated discussion, the most important members of the city nobility, clergy and guilds dramatically altered the course of history. Venice was to mobilize for a massive endeavor and transform over 80% of its merchant fleet into a war fleet, 50 war galleys in total. The treasury was to be emptied in order to fulfill a 3-year plan. After a grand speech on St. Mark's Square, Doge Tiepolo announced that the Republic would rise to the occasion and restore not just Rome itself, but the Roman Republic. Using their connections and wealth, Venice extended a hand to the decaying Latin Empire and purchased it for themselves. The Seventh Crusade called upon every French knight, leaving no fresh reinforcements for the struggling Latins. Back in 1204, the Partitio Terrarum Imperii Romanii was signed, making the Venetian Doge lord of a quarter and a half of the Roman Empire. Soon after, there was even a vote to move the capital to Constantinople, which almost succeeded. Members of the Inquisition immediately cracked down on the Orthodox clergy and imposed a new form of Christianity which was yet to form its concrete identity. The main goal was to give people hope in a time of crisis and direct their hatred towards those who failed them, a strategy that was carried out with great efficiency by some of the best educated orators of the time. Now they proceeded to take over every other merchant quarter that wasn't theirs already, specifically those of their rival Genoa. Once again, the Mongol incursion made it impossible for Genoa to defend its interests, and within just a few months, it was cut off from its main ally in the region, Nicaea. After imposing themselves in the region, Venice started creating allies and vassals. The Despotate of Epirus, Duchy of Athens, and Morea struggled with resources and needed naval support. Venice was capable of helping with both problems, setting them on a path that would eventually lead to their vassalization to the Republic. Bulgaria, which was in the middle of the turmoil of a regency, was next, and finally the powerful Serbian king Stefan Uros I also joined this new faction. Each state was given assurances and bribes, and in return, their leaders became subservient to the Doge and accepted this new branch of Christianity we now know as Tupolianism. This gave Venice the one thing they were lacking: land forces. For the past couple of decades, the Balkans saw interests constantly shift, depending on who was the dominant power, and at the time, it was the Empire of Nicaea, which had recently taken much of Thrace, including Philippopolis, Rodosta, Kypsela, Ceres, and most importantly, Adrianople and Thessaloniki. Venice held the key that led to the destruction of this dominant force, swaying all the smaller powers to what they soon realized was the new anti-Mongol faction. The Venetians were racing against time, as they knew that as soon as winter time arrived, the crisis would exacerbate, and Batu would start a new campaign. Messengers raced from one court to the next, as they set up one of the most influential plots in history within just 2 months. The Doge managed to get in touch with Denis Turye, a childhood loyal friend and companion of Bela IV of Hungary. Using their network of spies disguised as merchants, the Venetians were able to rescue the Hungarian king from captivity. First, most nomads stationed in Esztergom were lured by reports of a Venetian raid on Split. In the dark of night, Denis and 24 loyalists strangled the few remaining dungeon guards and rescued Bela. The king was loaded up on a carriage transporting lettuce and moved to friendly Serbia, where an army of mercenaries, as well as Serbians, Bulgarians and Epirotes, awaited him. Word quickly got out to the Mongol detachment, and to avoid distraction, they quickly left Hungary to rendezvous with Batu. As Bela marched forward toward the Hungarian capital, his citizens rejoiced at the passage of their now free king. Only a few regions refused to kneel to Bela, most notably the autonomous regions of Slavonia, Croatia and Bosnia, who saw more freedoms at the hand of Batu than they ever did under Bela. Batu was furious. He knew that the loss of Hungary would put him in a dangerous position. He was forced to abandon Italy, despite the fact that a few cities still resisted in the north. Hungary was the doorway to the Eurasian steppe, and losing it now would not only risk his life, but unravel all the gains the Mongols had made, a domino effect that could endanger his lands from the Danube to the Volga. Batu bid Frederick II goodbye, presenting him with his personal hunting eagle, and rode away from Italy alongside Bela's son Stephen, who by this point was more Mongol than Hungarian after months of campaigning with his captors. In May 1249, Batu gathered his entire host of 19,200 steppe warriors and moved towards the Hungarian capital in a race for the kingdom. Along the way, they gazed upon the bustling city of Venice, protected by the Adriatic Sea. The Mongols sacked several fishing villages along the coastline and taunted the Venetians, but to no avail. The Alps are the great barrier separating Italy from France and Germany, but that shield has 2 openings on the east, which is where the Mongols wanted to go. One went through the friendly territory of Gorizia, held by Meinhard I, while the other at Trieste was held by the Venetians since 1203. Other crossings, such as the one Batu used to get into the peninsula, were also available, but those were riskier and would allow Bela to rally a massive Hungarian host. So in reality, that only left 2 available routes for Batu, of which he chose the southern one, so that he could quell resistance and deplete the strength of his enemies along the coast. What he didn't count on, however, was how many Christians flocked to Venice after the sack of Rome, and that they had been preparing Mongol countermeasures ever since Batu entered Italy. On May 25th, the massive Mongol horde approached the floodplains of Inlisonchim, or as we know it today, Isonzo River, surprised to find it fortified and guarded on the other side. The river was treacherous, wide, and patrolled by Venetian war galleys and smaller vessels, protected by wooden shields. On board were numerous crossbowmen, who fired at the Mongol forces via tiny slits or wooden doors which were closed while the crossbow was being reloaded. And these weren't just Venetians. Refugees from all across Italy, including cities allied to Frederick, were spread across the river in small contingents. Large contingents also guarded some of the narrower points from various local nobles. The delta was where the Venetians, including Doge Jacopo Tiepolo, were stationed, while the Patriarch of Aquileia, Berthold, took position upstream. Previously, in 1241, the Patriarch participated in the defense of the Holy Roman Empire, and since then urged the Pope and Emperor to call for a crusade. Now he had evacuated his entire city and armed the citizens along the Pieris front, his contingent bolstered by the force sent by Trieste. Finally, Between the Isonzo and Torre rivers was a large contingent made up of the Dukes of Carinthia and Carniola, Bernhard Spanheim and Ulrich III Spanheim, alongside Philip Spanheim, who was the Archbishop of Salzburg. This great family line had 90 heavy-mounted knights under their service, and was ready to fall back to the second line at Saint-Pierre should the Mongols break through. The different contingents had a continuous line of communication, allowing them to redeploy to the areas the Mongols would attempt to cross. In total, the Allied force was made up of 28 warships, 52 smaller vessels, 5,000 infantry, 4,000 crossbowmen, and around 110 knights. The Mongols had the numerical advantage. Their troops had the better range, more disciplined warriors, and faster mobility, but in the floodplain of the Isonzo, they were stripped of most of their advantages. Batu made camp at the ruins of Aquileia and considered his options, while his scouts looked for a crossing. The Mongols had no siege engineers, and couldn't afford to look weak by asking their Italian allies for help. Venice was unreachable. The Isonzo was deep, surrounded by mountainous terrain, forming deep gorges, and each day Bela was getting closer to achieving his goal. The ground was soft and wet, which meant that no more than a few hundred horsemen could be deployed in any given location, and resources were scarce. Looting was an option, but not if the Mongols could not sack cities that had already submitted to them. Not to mention that the only major settlement in the area was Ogedei, which was far away and couldn't feed a force of 20,000 on its own. As the scouts came back, they reported that they had found 2 narrow openings that no more than a dozen enemies defended. Batu gave the order, and 500 Mongols headed to each of them. There was no sign of resistance, so before sentries could approach, each of the 2 groups began crossing the Isonzo. Mongol horses were smaller than their European counterparts, and many were washed away along with their riders, while others made it to the other side. With a stable footing secured, most rushed into the water, at which point bolts began flying from all directions. The coalitions left these gaps in the lines on purpose, and pounced on the invaders while they were defenseless. The Isonzo turned red, and bodies floated downstream for both sides to witness. Of the 1,000 Mongols, only 78 made it back to camp. Batu dispatched 2 groups towards Ogedei, each one consisting of 2,000 warriors, but they had different goals. While they were away, the remaining 14,000 were spread across the river and took turns in trying to fire over it, striking down enemies where they stood. This standoff continued for a week, during which both sides learned each other's weaknesses. The Allies had control of the river, and fishing provided them with a steady stream of food the Mongols lacked, while both sides took advantage of the dense forests around the river and hunted wild game. Most Mongols did the unthinkable and abandoned their horses, opting for sneak attacks from the top of trees. In that week, around 610 Allied soldiers were struck down while fishing or defending their posts. On the 4th day, the Mongols tracked the movements of a Venetian galley, and at a given signal, fired barrages of arrows from multiple angles, cleaning out its crew before withdrawing. But the Allies didn't stay idle. The projectile exchange was usually in their favour, particularly in the delta area. Multiple crossing attempts were stopped, and most notably, 2 sallies were attempted once they found out which areas were guarded by Mongols on foot. 3 ships were tied together, making a makeshift bridge with ladders connecting both sides of the river near Papariano, allowing a contingent of nearly 1,000 men to descend upon the Mongol position and devastate their ranks before pulling back. Overall, Batu lost just over 1,300 men in the span of 6 days. But then, on the 7th day, he made his move. While his first detachment of 2,000 men brought back supplies from Ogedei, the other group crossed the much smaller Torre River and returned to the front line. 500 of them were heavy lancers, while the rest were swift horse archers. Both groups charged at the Spanheim camp, which was caught completely off guard. The alarm was sounded and a network of bonfires was lit, letting everyone up to the delta know what was happening. ships began rowing upstream, trying to reinforce the point, while Batu ordered 3,000 men to cross the Torre. Bernhard rallied his knights and formed a line at a narrow strip, squeezed by bends of both rivers, only 260 meters across. Desperate stragglers tried to swim to safety, discarding their equipment as the Mongols pressed on. The fighting was intense, but the brave Imperial Knights held the line, as their shields deflected thousands of arrows. The densely forested area made it difficult for support fire from the Mongols to reach the enemy, and within 40 minutes, ship after ship joined the fight on either side. Venetian crossbows fired at the flanks of the Mongols, and even the Doge's flagship, the Bucintoro, joined the battle, sending ballista bolts against the steppe warriors. After another hour of intense fighting, the battlefield turned to mud and was littered with casualties. The Mongols pulled back to the camp that was already being built by the 3,000 that made it over to Vilnese, and before long, Batu and the remainder of his forces moved across under the constant barrage of crossbows. The intense clashes ended all hope of crushing the resistance and razing Trieste to the ground. With their tails between their legs, 11,000 Mongols finally crossed the Isonzo through allied Gorizia. Bernhard lost his son Ulrich in the fighting, but for him and the rest of the coalition, this was an incredible victory that solidified the Venetians as the last bastion of hope in Italy. Back in the west, plots also ran deep in the French court. Louis had given his life to prevent the utter destruction of Christendom, but now the question was how to retake and rebuild what the Mongols destroyed, and punish those who aided them. Batu had lost nearly everything and everyone, but in his fury, his resolve only hardened. He still had just over 10,000 of the best warriors that ever rode the steppe, and he held the Hungarian heir, Bella's only son, Stefan, who by this point was brainwashed. Venice failed to prevent Batu from leaving Italy. Still, they did manage to buy Bella enough time to rally the majority of Hungary behind him with the aid of a combined Serbo-Bulgarian Epirot army. But before the clash of old rivals, of father and son, and even before the Venetian attempts to restore the Roman Republic, we need to discuss another ambitious side ready to hatch its plan. So let us rewind the clocks to May 1248, when the brothers of Louis, Count of Poitiers, Alphonse, and Count of Anjou, Charles, received the news of his death. They now knew that the future of France was hanging in the balance, but they had different opinions on how to fix the situation. Alphonse was eager to protect the claim of his 5-year-old nephew, who was, surprise surprise, also Louis. Meanwhile, Charles was more ambitious and less trusting of Queen Regent Margaret. Both of them failed in subduing Savoy and protecting Rome, and now Alphonse had to prove himself worthy as his brother's successor. Surrounded by fear, angry Provençal nobles, and heretical movements, the two decided to move back to Toulouse and attempt to gain a few powerful allies for the wars to come. Alphonse was married to Raymond VII of Toulouse's daughter, Joan, and the two stopped by before the coronation and attempted to secure his allegiance. The Count of Poitiers was a skilled warrior, capable administrator, and dedicated diplomat, but Raymond was an old and bitter man who still felt the scars of the Albigensian Crusade. In an attempt to convince him, Alphonse pledged to deal with the rebel baron Roger of Foix, who took advantage of the papal fall to settle old scores with the Bishop of Vogel. Upon learning that the French army was on its way, Roger fled to the castle of Carcassonne, which the brothers quickly besieged. After 2 uneventful weeks, Charles of Anjou volunteered to speak with the Regency of Aragon and ensure they were still on the same side. Negotiations dragged on for a month, during which many issues were discussed. Aragon laid claim to Provence, which was to pass down to James's newborn son. They wanted vengeance for the death of their king, and the council, led by Queen Violante, also revealed that their control over what was previously the Taifa of Valencia and Majorca was only nominal. Additionally, despite being one of the most successful Aragonese kings, James defeated 4 rebellions of the nobility in his lifetime, and the council was well aware that many of those rebels were plotting a 5th against the 8-year-old boy king Peter. Charles addressed each of these concerns, and just as the Venetians were preparing to free Bela IV, he returned to Carcassonne at the head of a 7,000-strong Aragonese army, escorting Peter of Aragon and his mother Violante. Alphonse was delighted by his brother's accomplishment as the siege camp grew. A few days after the reunion, the two brothers and their escort were on a hunt when a fateful encounter again shifted the course of history. The most famous but undoubtedly redacted account of that event survives in the play of the great playwright Wolf, who wrote, "You speak of truth, the Lord and succession, but 'twas our brother who perished on holy mission. All you would bring us is submission, plagued by cowardice and indecision. The fates have bestowed me with a chance, not one for chivalry or true romance. My sins run thick and dark as night, for I must cleanse France of its unholy blight. I shan't sit here foolish and pretend, whilst you invoke folly and our people rend. Your speedy reign is at an end. Thou must now fall, so that I ascend." Louis and Alphonse knew that their brother was treacherous, but neither could have predicted this fratricidal act. Some sources claim that Charles acted out of greed and ambition, while others defend his motives as that of a desperate man trying to save his kingdom. Following the shocking death of Alphonse, Roger of Foix was pardoned under the condition that he and his men would join Charles's crusade after accepting him as the rightful king. There are no records of a funeral being held for Alphonse. Instead, a huge wedding feast was thrown in Calais, an exclave of Aragon's crown within Toulouse's territory. The city's symbolic location fit perfectly to the occasion, as the houses of Toulouse and Aragon were joined in matrimony. Raymond VII narrowly avoided the end of his bloodline and the loss of his territory to the French crown by marrying Princess Yolande, James's firstborn daughter, who was merely 12, while his own daughter, Joan, married the young King Peter, who was 8. To add to the celebrations, Charles also remarried Beatrice of Provence, adopting her newborn that was most likely his own. While at the dinner table, Charles reportedly said, "I told you, my love, you will never be shunned by your sisters again, for now thee are of a greater queen than any of them." While the latter marriage was more than just a political move, Charles sacrificed one of the most wealthy parts of his domain, even ceding the territory the French crown held, most importantly Narbonne. In return, he gained two powerful allies, which were previously huge rivals to France, allies that he needed for what he was about to do next. He did all of this political maneuvering without legal authority or the approval of the religious authority. He didn't even notify the royal council in Paris, essentially acting like he was the king. Charles bet his life and the fate of the realm on one expedition, one that would restore his reputation and bring stability to a kingdom now cluttered with heretical movements. The Queen of Aragon, who happened to be of Hungarian descent, was well aware of the Venetian movements, since she had even contributed to their war chest, and this gave Charles the idea to strike at the heart of the enemy, instead of making another push into a desolated Germany, which would only benefit distant princes. While the Mongols were away, he could use the strength of the French and Aragonese navy to attack Frederick, who most Catholics called the Antichrist for helping the Mongols sack Rome. Batu was far away, but Charles knew that destroying Frederick would give him the status of the Defender of the Cross, and all the legitimacy he needed to take the throne. A grand ceremony was held in Narbonne, where the combined army of French, Occitan, Provençal, Aragonese and Catalan soldiers took the cross, with only a small portion of Alphonse's men deciding to return home to Poitou. The combined force of 9,000 boarded over 200 vessels and headed east in mid-April 1249. Along the way, they stopped and resupplied at Marseille, Nice, and then crucially stumbled upon a besieged Genoa under attack by Emperor Frederick II's forces. While Batu was away, the emperor was busy solidifying his hold over Italy. As he took over Florence and Bologna, Ezzelino captured Piacenza and Bergamo, while his illegitimate son, Enzo of Sardinia, secured the island with the help of the Pisan fleet. The Genoese had lost valuable men in their effort to save Rome, but they failed to save Genoese Pope Innocent IV, so they begged Charles to help them defend their city. However, the French would-be monarch wanted a complete victory, and he knew he wouldn't get that in a prolonged siege. He needed a decisive clash to secure his position as the Crusader king Christendom would rally behind. So he sent an envoy to Frederick, laying out his entire plan. Charles told the emperor that he would invade his Sicilian kingdom, the first domain he had held since he was 3 years old, and to quote, "Watch each one of your devil-worshipping subjects fall within the volcano of Mount Etna." The message was loud and clear, and after scouts reported the sight of the massive French fleet, Frederick was presented with a dilemma: abandon the siege of Genoa and race to the rich and fertile kingdom of Sicily, or call out Charles' bluff. 2 days passed, and Charles made sure horns were blown on every ship as he announced his passage to the south. The risk was too big, so the siege was lifted, and Frederick prepared to meet his foe in the south. Genoa agreed to lend a portion of its fleet, adding to the great numbers of the French navy, which made another stop, but this time in the hostile territory of Pisa. With just a handful of ships to defend its harbour, the Maritime Republic didn't stand a chance. Boarding vessels holding horses hit the shores, and French knights charged out against Frederick's most valuable Italian ally, as Pisa's fleet was a decisive factor in the war. The city bore the brunt of the fury shared by many Christian crusaders. There was no longer any threat of excommunication, and Charles knew he couldn't stay for long, so none were spared. With the fleet and soldiers away in Sardinia, the city was defenseless. Men and women ran across the cobbled streets in sheer panic as soldiers looted and butchered whatever they could get their hands on. A few members of the newly sprung heretical groups opened the gates to the invaders. Charles gazed upon the most beautiful cathedral outside of Rome, standing next to the 30-meter Tower of Pisa. Within just a single day, both were pulled to the ground with the help of mules and oxen, before the troops loaded their spoils on the ships and sailed off. Frederick had hoped to unite his force with that of the north, but now he was well aware that he had no time to waste, so he raced south. The supplies Charles had gathered were crucial for surviving the journey to Sicily, which was not at all a bluff, since there were no friendly ports where they could stop and restock. But before long, the island he studied in great detail, with the help of Catalonian cartographers, was in front of him. The fleet headed west, leaving a third of the total force close to Trapani, while the main force continued to Gela. The island's geography made it very difficult for an army without a navy to coordinate its attacks, which gave Charles the advantage. Unfortunately, upon his arrival, he was surprised to learn that there was fierce resistance among the locals, who remained loyal to Frederick. The emperor spent his lifetime transforming Sicily and South Italy into what many call the first modern state, with sophisticated bureaucracy, efficient tax collection, sturdy fortifications, and a thriving Muslim community. Charles' first goal of capturing Terranova was quickly abandoned, and his force made his way towards Syracuse, but once again he was met by giant walls, fierce opposition, and a desperate lack of siege weapons. The hopes of taking the city with the help of his fleet were quickly dissipated by the formidable and newly rebuilt Castello Maniaci. This mission was further complicated by the fact that despite what he told Frederick, Charles could not afford to plunder the prosperous kingdom, as that would go against his cause. He wanted Pisa to be the exception and not the norm, but maintaining order amongst his ranks was getting more challenging by the day. Once again, the last major city his forces marched on was impossible to take, as the Castello Ursino, which was constructed 2 years earlier, was impregnable, rivaling most of the continental castles of its time. Charles could plunder the suburbs, but could not establish a foothold in Sicily without popular support. Despite his reputation abroad, the Sicilians highly revered Frederick, a fact the French king failed to predict. It was already June, but instead of risking the disintegration of his force, Charles loaded his army on the fleet, which had been shadowing their every move, and sailed north, unsure of what his next move was. But just when he thought he'd made the worst gamble of his life, Charles spotted the Imperial fleet at the Strait of Messina at noon on June 15th. Frederick assessed the situation and was fully aware that the French were in a precarious position. Should they head west, they would be abandoning the entire campaign. However, they were likely to blockade and lay siege to Messina, or worse, land in mainland Italy near Calabria, so he took his fleet to one of the most narrow straits in the Mediterranean. Initially, Charles' fleet comprised 26 French vessels and 18 heavy Aragonese ships, with another 12 galleys, 17 Genoese, and 6 Provençal galleys, for a total of 79. However, 18 ships were still with a third of the army, invading the island's western side, reducing the total number to 61, not including the cargo ships, which were twice as many. Meanwhile, the imperial fleet consisted of 37 heavy royal ships and 22 Genoese galleys, captured after the Battle of Giglio in 1241. The Sicilian ships were some of the best warships in the Mediterranean, outfitted with towers and raised platforms at the front and back of the ships. On top of that, Frederick had a large company of Muslim archers from the southern colony of Lucera, renowned for their accuracy. Unfortunately for him, however, his army was being moved from Reggio to Messina, which meant that a good portion of his ships had fewer knights than his opponent. The emperor was aware of his vulnerable position and the presence of Charles in eastern Sicily, so he took precautions. 26 of his heavy ships were tied to each other using iron cords and positioned at the front, guarding the traffic of transport ships, while the remaining 11 sat at the back. Both sides arranged their formations in the prelude to the Battle of Messina. Charles had the wind on his side, but he needed 2 hours until his lines were drawn. By the time the coalition was ready to make their opening move, 12 of the 22 captured ships had already moved to the imperial flanks, each one filled with capable soldiers. The first to engage was the front line of 16 heavy Aragonese ships, which picked up speed from a gust of wind between 22 and 24 knots. Hundreds of crossbowmen fired at each other from both sides, but the raised platforms and towers gave the advantage to the imperial fleet, while the chained formation prevented it from breaking apart. The Aragonese sailors quickly picked up on this, and they began to gang up on a few of the ships, firing at them from multiple angles. A few of the other ships broke the iron tethers in 3 locations, breaking through the first line. Frederick reacted quickly and gave the command to the rowers of his flagship to engage them. The Muslim soldiers proved their worth, and before long, multiple Aragonese decks were wiped out. In the midst of the fighting, however, many were distracted and didn't notice the second line approaching from every side. The lighter galleys approaching from the shallower water quickly engaged their counterparts, but their numerical superiority, coupled with their years of experience at sea, made it an easy challenge. The ships captured from the Genoese could not withstand the barrage of bolts, which softened them up before they were boarded by furious Genoese and Aragonese fighters, desperate to avenge their pope and king. The second line of French and Provençal ships also joined the battle, many of which rammed into the broken formation of Sicilian ships. Some collisions were perpendicular, leaving them impaled against the enemy vessel. Grappling hooks were used to pull the imperial ships closer, until French knights in full armour boarded the enemy decks, where intense fighting ensued under the watchful eye of Mount Etna, which was seen in the distance. The first line, commanded by Admiral Ansaldo de Mari, was now scattered. Still, the skilled commander ordered his men to perform the periplus maneuver, the feigned retreat of the seas, which the Greeks used at the Battle of Salamis 1,728 years earlier. The rowers on the ships that weren't yet boarded began to pull away, while Frederick's second line attempted to squeeze in between the gaps and turn the tide. The Sicilian vessels cut the grappling hook ropes and used poles to push away the advancing French ships, while Muslim archers tried to remove as many enemies as possible. On the centre's right side, the successful maneuver resulted in the destruction of the oars of 3 Provençal and 2 French ships, knocking them out of the battle. 6 hours into the battle, the fighting was intense, as exhausted rowers left their stations and picked up a weapon. Sicilians boarded French vessels, and Aragonese marines jumped on Neapolitan ships, both sides struggling to survive. Overall, the heavily armoured French knights proved more effective when boarding, but Frederick had a ranged superiority, leaving the battle a stalemate. But that was when the Aragonese and Genoese galleys appeared at the rear. Both flanks had been cleared,
and now over 20 ships attacked from the opposite side. The Imperials fired ballista bolts from the towers and sprayed the enemy with oil, which was then ignited using flaming arrows, causing many casualties. But as the sun began to set and the noose tightened, morale began to wither. Bodies littered the waters, attracting sharks and other predators. Priests gave wounded soldiers their last rites in the middle of arrow fire, and people from either side of the strait gazed upon the epic clash. But then, 2 hours before midnight, Frederick's flagship was boarded by a group of knights in Charles' retinue. The emperor hid away, but as his fate became more and more certain, he ordered one of his bodyguards to take his life, so that he wouldn't be paraded through the streets of Paris. Charles went to Sicily for a decisive victory, and while he didn't imagine it to go the way it did, as he looked upon the vanquished Antichrist, he knew his status was solidified. This was precisely the victory he needed if he wanted to gain the crown, for back home in France, the widowed Margaret declared herself Queen Regent, with the backing of England, Brittany, Flanders, Navarre, and most of northern France. The War of the Provençal Sisters had begun. The fate of France would prove to be the most important but not only arena, as the whole of Europe was now plunged into conflict. After receiving a mauling at the Battle of Isonzo, Batu returned to the Hungarian Kingdom in summer 1249 and immediately unleashed his horsemen in a wave of reprisals. The escape of Bela IV from Esztergom the year before had led to much of the kingdom throwing off the Mongol yoke and tax collectors, with the aim of renewed independence, though much of the southern part of the kingdom in Slavonia, Croatia and Bosnia had refused to recognize Bela's authority and remained subject to the Mongols. But the brief period of restoration under Bela had not been enough to prepare defences and local forces, much of which was still in ruin from the Mongol invasions in 1241 and 1245. Batu's forces fought to put down the revolting Hungarian barons with great slaughter, and many submitted as soon as Batu's troops arrived at their doorstep. For those who surrendered or were crushed under Mongol hooves, payment of supplies, men, animals, and demands to tear down whatever fortifications remained were the price for their revolt. Bela's reputation and status as protector of Hungary had been greatly damaged by 2 disastrous Mongol invasions, and many Hungarian barons were decidedly braver in their words and deeds when it seemed that Batu was distant in Italy. The battle at the Isonzo had slowed but not halted Batu, and his quick return to Hungary quickly reminded many why they had submitted in the first place. However, the fires of rebellion continued to burn, and Batu's hold over Hungary was tenuous. While Batu held Bela's young son Stefan as a hostage, the young lad was no figure to rally the Hungarian barons around or to prop up the regime. Bela and his loyalists were mostly blockaded in strongholds around the kingdom, while others resorted to guerrilla warfare throughout the devastated countryside. It was a tense situation, as Bela desperately needed the promised aid from his Venetian allies. In the meantime, Batu Khan sent word east to call up reinforcements from the western steppes in today's Ukraine, conscripting more local forces and seizing more animals from the Hungarian plain to restore his lost horse herds. Stragglers from other Mongol armies destroyed elsewhere in Europe flocked to him. Even as his forces fought with the Hungarians, Batu gathered what information he could on his Venetian foes. By the end of summer 1249, he had learned of his ally, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick's death, an unfortunate loss to his plans. For the time being, Batu relied on Slavonia, Croatia and Bosnia as the buffer between himself and Venice's Balkan allies. Batu guessed that, rather than advance via the more exposed plains through Bulgaria and eastern Hungary, where the Mongols had the advantage in mobility, that Venice and her allies would pass via the Balkans' Adriatic coast, where they could be supplied by the Venetian navy, and have their flanks secured by mountain passes. Presumably they would strike at the parts of Hungary west of the Danube River, a more rugged, hillier zone, where the Mongolian cavalry would be hampered. From there they would assuredly seek to rescue Bela, besieged at Esztergom on the Danube's west bank. For Batu, he began to make preparations for this. For Venice and its new doge, Raniero Zeno, his efforts at establishing a new Roman Republic had begun well, but as 1249 unfolded, it was becoming a headache all its own.
He had succeeded in defeating Batu at the Isonzo River and getting Serbia, Bulgaria, the Latin Empire, and various despotates across Greece to recognize his authority, as well as make a show of pressing his form of Christianity over them, the so-called Tupulian Creed. But a recreation of the Roman Empire this was not. Zeno hoped his new allies would provide his land forces to confront Batu in Hungary, but it was easier said than done to make them follow his orders in practice. For all the threat the Mongols posed, each state seemed more interested in getting support from the others, and Venice in particular, to pay for and assist in dealing with internal or neighbourly disputes, while the Bulgarian Tsardom still reeled from civil war and earlier Mongol raids, which had so greatly destabilized it. And despite the death and defeat of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, the French under Charles of Anjou weren't providing material support for the Hungarian expedition due to an emerging civil war for control of France. As the War of the Provençal Sisters unfolded, it became clear that no further help from the West would come in the immediate future. Further compounding matters, once the danger of Batu had moved from their doorstep to seemingly distant Hungary, the Senate in Venice urged Zeno to expand and consolidate their hold over war-ravaged Italy, rather than follow Batu. Meanwhile, a considerable amount of pushback was being directed against Zeno's new plans for Christianity, as church factions across the Republic made all sorts of accusations and complaints against it. The result was that Zeno's project was costing an immense amount of money while struggling to get off the ground. In spite of these challenges, Zeno rose to the occasion. A skilled and experienced diplomat, he had talked his allies into this union, and he would now force them through it. Keenly aware that every month they gave Batu gave him a chance to plot his vengeance, Zeno, through concessions, punishments, threats, blackmail, bribes, promises, and hundreds of messengers sent aboard Venice's fastest ships, gradually cajoled his allies. Treasures taken from Constantinople in 1204 were resold to finance the efforts. Daughters and sons were sent off for marriage alliances. A few convenient deaths, leading to the later myths of Zeno financing an assassin network, helped get the project off the ground. By the spring of 1250, one of the most ambitious military operations ever taken by medieval Europe was launched. By May of 1250, the troops of Venice's restored Roman Republic were to converge on two locations, Zagreb and Belgrade. From there, they would march north in a pincer movement into western Hungary. The Western Army, consisting of mercenaries and soldiers from Italy, Serbia and Greece, was to be ferried by ship over the Adriatic, Ionian and Aegean seas to Split, and there march and sail along the coastline, shadowed and supplied by the Venetian navy. Lords in Croatia would be offered to join the alliance or die, and in this manner make their way to Zagreb. With a secure connection to the coast, Zagreb would be the springboard for the invasion into Mongol-occupied territory. In the eastern half of this Roman Republic, troops from Bulgaria and the Latin Empire were to march overland to Belgrade, and once there, take ships up the Danube or march along its southern flank, the Danube itself acting as a shield against the Hungarian plain, where the Mongols held dominance. If all went to plan, by the end of the summer, the two forces would unite in western Hungary and trap the Mongol army between themselves, Esztergom, the Danube River, and any surviving Hungarian troops. Such a complex plan ran into many difficulties, and relied on Esztergom withstanding the Mongol siege long enough. Sources have few details of the journey of the eastern wing, and dates differ for their movements. Passage through the mountains was slow, the route long and arduous. In the west, the Venetian-led forces made good initial progress, and the great force they assembled convinced many local lords to surrender rather than face a siege. Those who held out fell in rapid assaults, as Zeno's engineers brought pre-made ladders to rapidly scale the walls. Harder to assault fortresses had to be left under blockade in order to not harass the rear of Zeno's army or supply lines as he moved deeper inland onto Zagreb. It does not seem that Zeno's forces faced any Mongol forces, simply their local allies. In general, it seems over this period, Zeno had received little news from Hungary despite his spy networks. At most, he had conflicting accounts of the progress of the Hungarian rebellion. At the same time, he had no information as to the progress of the Eastern Bulgarian Latin army marching via Belgrade. He could only hope things were going to plan. In May of 1250, Zeno's army arrived at Zagreb, whose leaders killed their Mongol-appointed tax collector and declared for the Roman Republic, providing troops, supplies and information. Zagreb's leaders had heard nothing of the Eastern Army, but told Zeno that the Mongols had made some success against the Hungarian rebels over the winter and caused even greater violence. Their enforcers had come with more demands for supplies and men, which Zagreb had been slow to meet. All information was useful, but it did not provide illumination on what Zeno's next choices should be. For the following 2 weeks he stayed in Zagreb in frustrating indecision, hoping for guidance or information to judge his next moves. With news of scuffles over supplies and women between his troops and the locals, an anxious Zeno decided to roll the dice rather than let boredom flame in the army. He decided to strike east, marching south of Lake Balaton to head to the Danube, and from there march north. He hoped doing so would increase his likelihood of meeting up with the Eastern Army, while protecting one of his flanks with the mighty Danube. As they marched deeper into the ruins of the Hungarian Kingdom, they increasingly found devastation. Burned husks of villages, towns abandoned, or settlements where the dead were heaped into rotting piles. Cropland had been trampled or burnt, left to fallow and turned over into pasture. While initially it was assumed to be the result of the Mongol-Hungarian warfare, it became apparent that Batu must have ordered scorched earth along the routes he expected Zeno to take. As foraging parties came back with less and less each time, Zeno needed to lighten the load. He ordered camp followers and persons deemed not immediately required for the battle to be sent back, lightening the burden on their supplies. Cinching their belts, rations were reduced to stretch them further, and a network of scouts sent in all directions to watch both the Mongols or the Eastern Army. As June 1250 wore on and Zeno's army followed the Danube north, it remained eerily quiet. Passing Pest, they saw from across the river how the city was left a smoke-and blackened ruin. Their goal was Esztergom, and aside from a few frightened farmers who spoke only of horrors, they had seen little sign of human life. Once more, indecision gnawed at Zeno, uncertain what would await them at Esztergom. They halted on the northern edge of Castle Hill, in today's Budapest, the Váhegy. At this time it was unfortified, and using wagons and hurriedly made ditches, the Republic's army made a temporary fortification for themselves, a brief chance to rest for a day or two, while Zeno's commanders mulled over what to do next. The decision proved to be a timely one. It began that night. Scouts sent out that day did not return. Some accounts speak of birds and wild animals with burning bundles of straw tied to them and sent running against the Venetians' camp. Others say the tree line on the hill above the Venetians was set on fire by lightning. Regardless of the source, it frightened the Republic's forces and distracted them as Mongol riders suddenly appeared around the other sides of the camp and began pelting them with projectiles. Though taken by surprise, Zeno had prepared his officers for such an event. The Republic's forces, Serbian, Italian, Greek and more, mounted the wagons with spear and bow. A fierce skirmish between archers and crossbowmen took place. The winds blew south, pushing against the Republic's arrows, but also blowing the fire uphill and away from the camp. Groups of Mongols dashed to and fro, hoping to provoke a contingent of Zeno's troops into pursuing, but they held firm. The heat from the flames made some remove their armor, and those who did were punished with Mongol arrows. This skirmishing wore on into the night and early the next day. Small groups of Mongols were left to sporadically shoot at the Republic troops and keep them on edge, but the dramatic start did not turn into a great battle. The following day was spent taking stock of losses and understanding what had occurred. Losses were minimal, and while under guard, parties were sent out to collect arrows and projectiles from the battlefield. The camp was refortified, proper ditches dug along some of its length, and the excess dirt strengthened the wagon wall. Another night was spent in the camp, to await and see what the Mongols would do next. The night was quiet but watchful, the Republic's troops expecting arrows to fly at them from the darkness at any moment. Zeno kept his men on watch in shifts, but little sleep was had due to adrenaline and the light still cast from the burning Castle Hill. Finally, as the watches ended at first light on the third day, a sudden yell came up from the tree line. Arrows came flying, drums were beat. The attack once more began. This time a crowd of Hungarian peasants, starved and injured, was sent running towards the Republic's camp, prodded on by Mongol riders. Italian crossbowmen struck down many before they realized what was happening. Stumbling over each other and pierced by Italian bolts, their bodies began to fill in the ditch along the northern side. One Austrian officer with a knowledge of Hungarian shouted at the farmers to enter the camp and join them in defense, saving a few from that wretched fate. As a gap in the wagons was made to bring the peasants into the camp, a group of heavily armoured Mongol horsemen charged forth. Much slaughter and damage was done before the horsemen were surrounded and killed. By noon, this round of combat was over, and Zeno's forces were now looking ragged. The Hungarian peasants were interviewed, and the picture became clear to Zeno. Most of the rebelling Hungarian lords in this area who had not submitted to Batu were killed or still were trapped in their fortresses. Bela IV and an increasingly starved garrison were still holding out in Esztergom, which was under tight blockade. With a system of ferries further upriver, the Mongols were freely crossing back and forth over the Danube. Most of their army was dispersed in camps or blockades, but a sizable force under Batu himself had been shadowing Zeno's march for days. No news had been heard of the Eastern Army of the Republic. News that Bela lived was still encouraging despite the setbacks. With a renewed sense of purpose, Zeno ordered the army to move onwards to Esztergom, following along the Danube to keep at least one flank secure, stopping to fortify their camp every night. It would be a longer route, but minimized their risk. They broke camp immediately, the army tired but with spirits higher than they had been in days. All were eager to escape the shadow of Castle Hill. Mongol riders continued to shadow them, and over the next 2 days, skirmishes continued to occur, albeit on a smaller scale. Progress was slow, carefully choosing their route, and going easy on the men. On the third day, they sighted the proud hill of Esztergom, its citadel still tall amidst a burnt and blackened countryside. Siege lines and a Mongolian palisade surrounded the base of the fortress, with another palisade erected in the face of the oncoming Republic's army. The air tasted of smoke, and a Mongol army was lined up to face them, smaller parties in the distance streaming in to reinforce. Zeno's cavalry, so far untested, was formed up alongside the crossbowmen. The rest went to work on putting together a wagon fort to fall back to if need be, and secure their flank. Small Mongol groups started towards the Republic's troops, seeking to draw them into feigned retreats, but Zeno kept a tight hold on his men. Both sides had learned important lessons over the last years, and neither was hasty to commit too early. With his northern flank protected by the Danube and his eastern flank by his wagon lager, Zeno kept his forces arrayed in a semicircle facing south. The Mongols kept their forces dispersed and some distance away, keeping plenty of room to maneuver and trying to deny the Republic a chance to keep them pinned. No major engagement occurred on the first day of the standoff, and at night, Zeno carefully had his men fall into the lager. As expected, the Mongols shot arrows into the camp to keep the Republic awake. Less expected was that under the cover of darkness, the Mongols had set up siege engines in range of Zeno's camp. The low structures of the Republic's camp proved hard to strike in the dark, and thus only a few shots landed. As the sun slowly rose, the aim of the siege crews gradually improved, and Zeno was forced to act. At daybreak, a select group of well-armoured knights charged out of the camp towards the siege machines, the rest of the army forming up behind them. The catapult crews rapidly tried to pull back their machines, and other parts of the Mongol army rushed over to protect them. The knights managed to hack at a few of the machines though, cutting through the ropes, keeping tension on them and breaking them, or hacking at the necks of their operators. As the knights withdrew to the safety of the line, the Republic forces had finished forming up for battle. Another day followed of skirmishing, but no battle was had. It was the last day of June, and Zeno began to worry what plans Batu had that made him so hesitant for battle. The question was answered that night. Watchmen on the wagon fort drew alarm to shapes in the distance. By the morning of July 1st, 1250, it was obvious what had happened. Mongols on the east side of the Danube had marched over and crossed the river in the darkness with their ferries. Whereas Zeno's army had initially enjoyed local superiority of numbers, it seemed now that the Mongols had evened the odds. A German-speaking knight in Mongol service rode to the camp and passed on a short message. Strength of heaven, in the name of the Khan of East and West, and his nephew, Batu, son of Jochi, son of Genghis, to Raniero Zeno, Doge of Venice, the warriors of our Lord the Khan are more numerous than the sands, their hearts harder than the mountains, their swords of the sharpest steel. No kingdom before the rising or the setting of the sun has stood against our horses, and only you, Dukes of Venice, stands before us. Cold and alone, who are you to resist? Surrender now and return home, or make these soils here your shelter forever. Our patience will last until dawn tomorrow. Zeno received the message with stern expression as the Mongols filled the land between his camp and the Esztergom citadel. Small figures could be seen on the walls, presumably Bela IV, watching eagerly for rescue. In front of him, the Mongols had men clearing the ground of obstructions to make it more suitable for cavalry. Batu himself could be seen, observing from his large yurt built upon a platform, giving orders and drinking with his generals. Having had trouble resupplying over the last weeks, now his army's foodstuffs were too low to withstand a siege. Zeno ordered a final feast for his men. With full bellies, they would enjoy one last night before their fate was determined the next day. They made sure their music and song could be heard by the Mongol lines, showing they weren't afraid in the face of Batu's threats. At dawn the next day, the Republic's forces formed up for battle, Zeno himself at the front in crimson and gold-trimmed armor. Yet as he marched out with the sunrise, the Mongol army was rapidly reassembling towards the southeast, where drums and horns were sounding. By some miracle, it was the eastern army of Bulgarians and troops of the Latin Empire. The early advance of Zeno had kept Mongol eyes on the western army, allowing the eastern troops to advance almost unseen. Though tired and hungry, they had followed the cleared trail left behind by Zeno's forces. Now both formed up for battle on the morning of July 2nd. The Republic's army outnumbered the Mongol force, totaling about 25,000, mostly infantry, crossbowmen and archers, and a few hundred knights and other cavalry, divided into main bodies to the north and east. They were men drawn all the way from Italy across the Balkans to Constantinople, as well as a hefty number of mercenaries from across Europe. Weary and hungry, the diverse army was untested in battle as a united force. In contrast, Batu's host totaled perhaps 13,000, having received only slight reinforcements. Much of his army was Turkic and Mongol troops of the steppe, but a number of Germans and Hungarians who had sided with him stood in his army. His siege weapons still stood in range of the Republic's camp, and began the battle with a barrage aimed at Zeno's troops, while his horse archers began to menace the newly arrived Latins and Bulgarians. Zeno ordered a general advance, trying to maintain a good formation though under barrage. He hoped to push Batu's army back into the ruins of Esztergom's suburbs, and deny them their mobility. He sent riders to alert the eastern army of the plan, but Batu would not be so easily shepherded. The Latin-Bulgarian army was worn out from their march, and slow to advance. The Mongols' arrows focused on their flanks, where lightly armoured Vlach troops had been placed. They sought to retreat into the core of the army, halting its progress. As Zeno's force advanced onwards without the support of the eastern force, his left flank became exposed. When the catapult barrage suddenly halted, part of the Mongol vanguard suddenly rushed forward at his flank. Their lances leveled, they broke right through the poorly rested Serbs on that side, despite a ferocious fight. Zeno ordered his precious cavalry to reinforce that wing, but as his cavalry drew behind his lines to the left, Mongol cavalry then struck Zeno's now exposed right flank. Uncertainty gripped his host, and for a moment the advance halted. Heavily armoured Mongol archers now rode ahead of his centre, and dismounted to shoot precisely into the heavily armoured Venetian infantry leading the advance. The Mongols' efforts had focused most of their resources onto Zeno in those minutes, easing pressure on the Latins and Bulgarians, who picked up the advance once more and now threatened the Mongol right. Batu recalled his troops and was forced to pivot, gradually bringing his rear towards Esztergom citadel. His horsemen cycle-charged back and forth at the Republic's lines and inflicted heavy losses on the foe. Batu's forces were better rested and better fed than either of his rivals, and slew many. But with weight of numbers, the Republic continued to press the advance. Suddenly shouts came from the Mongol rear. King Bela IV of Hungary and his tired, ragged, near-starving garrison rushed out from Esztergom directly into the unguarded Mongol rear lines. Batu's host was suddenly surrounded. Panic spread through the Mongol lines. Though Bela's force was small, most of Batu's army did not know this, only that they were surrounded. New energy gripped the Republic's force, and they brought their weight to bear. Caught between the citadel and the opposing armies, Batu concentrated his might on a breakthrough to save as many of his troops as possible. On the far flank, where the Vlach troops had earlier suffered under Mongol arrows, Batu's personal bodyguard punched through the line, and a steady stream followed. Heavy losses were taken, but Batu escaped the field. The Republic's troops pursued. Batu took the ferries back over the river, while his archers laid down a withering barrage. The exhausted Republic troops fell in staggering numbers against the Mongol rearguard, and Zeno called a halt. His worn-out forces watched as the Mongols and their allies were ferried back over the river. The Battle of Esztergom at the start of July 1250 proved to be the final great battle of the invasion. Though small sieges of Mongol holdouts continued, and Batu spent some time in eastern Hungary and Romania, by the start of 1251, Batu and the remainder of his forces withdrew to the steppe. With his forces so worn down and disillusioned, conquest was simply no longer feasible. With head held low in shame, Batu returned to the Mongol Empire to learn what had transpired there in his absence. He died only a year later, never reaching Mongolia again. His son Sartak was appointed to succeed him in the lineage. He gradually and slowly sought to rebuild the strength of Batu's horde, but did not enjoy the prominence of his father. Deeming Europe unsuitable for immediate conquest, it was left on its own to pick up the pieces. Bela IV had fallen in the fighting, and his young son Stefan was recrowned King of Hungary through Zeno's efforts. However, the greatly devastated Hungary was now subject to the power of individual lords, its central monarchy too weak under a child king to provide a basis for reunification in the future. Raniero Zeno did not long enjoy his victory. The immense effort of the last years had weakened him and put great strain on his heart. He died, it is said, of a heart attack on the journey back to Venice, though accusations of poisoning by his rivals abound. The huge cost of his restored Roman Empire bankrupted Venice, and the victory had brought no great conquest to offset the expense. With his death, there was neither the will nor the interest in continuing it. By 1260, independence had been achieved across nearly all of the participants in this experiment, and Venice became a minor power in northern Italy, where Genoa rose to dominate over its fallen rivals. But this is but one possible ending to this story, with this version of Europe having the Holy Roman Empire effectively destroyed, France torn apart by civil war, Rome burned, and the Pope killed. There are other stories perhaps for another day somewhere else. How do you think this version of Europe would turn out? Tell us in the comments below. To make sure you don't miss our future episodes, subscribe and press the bell button to see them. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.